Member Graham served as the board member on scene following the derailment and did an excellent job. We're joined by our colleagues, Member Alvin Brown and Member Todd Inman, who joined the agency in March. For those who are not familiar with the NTSB, we are an independent federal agency charged by Congress with investigating every civil aviation accident in the United States and significant events in all modes of transportation, including train derailments. In accordance with our regulations, NTSB's accident and incident investigations are conducted to determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances relating to an accident or incident and the probable cause thereof. This information is then used to ascertain measures that would best prevent similar accidents or incidents in the future. Accident and incident investigations are fact-finding proceedings and are not conducted for the purpose of determining the rights or the liabilities of any party. Today's meeting is open to the public in accordance with the Government and the Sunshine Act. We're here to discuss the final investigation report of the February 3rd, 2023 derailment and subsequent hazardous materials release involving Norfolk Southern Railway General Merchandise Freight Train 32N here in East Palestine, Ohio. The derailment occurred shortly after a hot bearing detector broadcast a critical alarm about a wheel bearing's temperature. 38 rail cars derailed, 11 of which were transporting hazardous material. 3 of these hazardous materials tank cars sustained mechanical breaches during the derailment and released flammable or combustible materials. 5 others released flammable gases as a result of fire exposure and deliberate breaching with explosives to perform a vent and burn procedure. On behalf of the entire agency, I want to recognize the significant impact that this derailment has had on the community in East Palestine, Ohio, in Darlington, Pennsylvania, and all the surrounding areas throughout the state of Ohio, throughout the state of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, some have sought to minimize the wide-ranging impacts of this derailment, pointing to the fact that there were no fatalities or injuries. For this, we are certainly grateful, but the absence of a fatality or injury doesn't mean the presence of safety. The absence of a fatality or injury doesn't mean the presence of safety. The NTSB exists to ensure the presence of safety, to shine light on the vulnerabilities that compromise safety. We don't wait for a death or injury to occur. We bring safety issues to the forefront and make recommendations that, if implemented, would prevent the next train derailment or fire. To the community at large, on behalf of the NTSB, I'm so sorry that this happened. We are so sorry that this happened here. Our hearts are with you. Today may be difficult for many of you. So volunteer mental health clinicians from the American Red Cross and Salvation Army are available throughout today's proceedings. Please see staff at the back. We have Elias Contanis and we have Stephanie Matonic of East Palestine High School for hosting us once again for this final board meeting and for all their work and kind words and actions welcoming us to East Palestine during the investigative hearing last June. I want to thank the East Palestine Police Department, East Palestine Fire and EMS, the Columbiana County Sheriff's Office, Ohio State Highway Patrol, in particular the Lisbon Post, and Federal Protective Services Region 5, Chicago, for working with us closely since day one of this investigation through our hearing in June and now this board meeting. I also want to thank the numerous police officers, firefighters, dispatchers, hazmat teams, EMTs, and others who responded to this derailment. 48 entities were involved in the response, including the East Palestine Police Department, the East Palestine Fire Department, and fire departments from neighboring communities and throughout the state, including East Liverpool and Beaver County. Thank you so much for all you do and every day to ensure safety. Our investigative process entailed extensive development of the facts and circumstances surrounding the accident. We conducted fact-finding with the input of our parties and conducted a public hearing. Following the hearing, we developed a transcript and added it and all statements to the public docket, which is available on our website at ntsb.gov. Thus, the fact-finding portion of our investigation was complete months ago. That aspect of the investigation culminated with an offer to our parties to make party submissions in which they could provide proposed findings to be drawn from the facts that we developed, otherwise called the evidence produced during the course of the investigation, a proposed probable cause, and our proposed safety recommendations designed to prevent future accidents. We have utilized the intervening time to conduct analysis, independent analysis of the evidence, a part of our independent investigation that is within the sole purview of the NTSB. Now, each board member has studied the draft report and met individually with the investigative team, but this is the first time that the board has gathered together to discuss the report. In a moment, the investigative team will walk us through the event, present the pertinent facts and analysis and findings, and summarize the findings in detail. After their presentations, board members will question staff on the key safety issues uncovered during the investigation. Staff will then propose the relevant findings, probable cause, and safety recommendations for board consideration. Following the incorporation of any amendments voted on today, the final report will be available on our website in a few weeks. This allows time for staff to make final edits. However, an abstract will be available today. There are 2 public dockets for the investigation. One was released prior to the hearing in June 2023 and includes the complete hearing transcripts. The second docket was released on January 25, 2024 this year. Again, they're available at ntsb.gov. Before we hear from the investigative team, I'd like to invite Member Graham, who again was the board member on scene during this investigation, to make a statement. Member Graham, you're recognized for as much time as you may consume.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Chair Hamady, board members Chapman, Brown, and Inman, investigative staff, and those joining us in person and live online. As we convene today to conclude our investigation into the train derailment in East Palestine, I want to begin by acknowledging the profound impact this incident has had on the community. To the people of East Palestine and the surrounding communities, we extend our deepest sympathies. We recognize the fear, disruption, and hardship you have endured. This board is committed to ensuring that your voices are heard and that your experiences help guide our pursuit of safety improvements on our nation's railways. I arrived with the NTSB investigative team on Saturday, February 4th. On Sunday, our command post was moved to the Unity Fire Station. When the team arrived, we were greeted by a volunteer firefighter who couldn't have been more than 18 to 19 years old. We started talking and quickly learned this young man was among the many firefighters who responded in minutes following the derailment. He told us about his experiences that night, receiving the call, quickly responding with his friends and fellow volunteer firefighters to protect their community, and the dangers they faced on the scene. Later, the firefighter's mother surprised us by bringing the NTSB investigative team a crock pot full of homemade sloppy joes, chips, and water for lunch. I'll never forget that. To me, the story of that mother and the son symbolizes the spirit, the resilience, and the character of East Palestine and the surrounding communities. In the wake of the immense tragedy, the community came together. Your strength and unity in the face of adversity has deeply moved us. Today, we present our findings mindful of the challenges faced by those affected. We are here to ensure that the lessons learned from this derailment will lead to meaningful change so no other community has to relive the challenges faced by the people of East Palestine. I also want to extend my deepest gratitude to our investigative team. Your dedication and meticulous work have been exemplary. Your efforts not only help us understand what went wrong, but pave the way for vital safety recommendations that, if implemented, will prevent similar accidents in the future and enhance the safety of our nation's railways. To the community of East Palestine, please know that your safety and well-being are at the forefront of our mission. Our work will not end with the issuance of the safety recommendations today, but rather we will continue to pursue and advocate for these safety recommendations until each one is implemented. Thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to make an opening statement, and I look forward to the meeting today.
Thank you so much. Well said. Excellent statement. Before turning it over to the investigative team, we held a community meeting last night to discuss our investigative process. I see many are back today. Thank you so much for coming in and meeting with us last night. I invite everyone back tonight for another community meeting at 6 right here in this room to answer questions you may have regarding the proceedings today, regarding all our evidence, regarding findings. We can get into as much detail as you want, and we will be here in this room for as long as it takes to answer all your questions and make sure you're heard. I'll now ask Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce members of the NTSB team participating in today's meeting. Good morning, Mr. Curtis.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Homendy. A few announcements before we begin. I kindly request the folks here in the auditorium, if you have not already done so, please silence your mobile phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, the NTSB will call 911. We also have medics on site who are trained to provide CPR and use an AED. The NTSB will radio the medics for assistance if needed. Should we need to evacuate, there are 3 points for exit, one on either side of the stage and at the back of the auditorium where you entered. In the event of an emergency, please walk quickly to the nearest exit. Don't run and make your way outside. Once you have exited the building, please follow the sidewalk to the parking lot across the street from the school. Please follow the instructions of local police. Do not delay and do not return to the auditorium until instructed to do so. I will now introduce staff for today's meeting. In the first row, to my right, Michael Hiller, Deputy Director, Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations. Ruben Payan, Investigator in Charge. Paul Stansel, Hazardous Materials. Troy Lloyd, Initial Emergency Response and Track. Joey Ryan, Mechanical. Greg Scott, Signals, Train Control, and Wayside Defect Detectors. And Dr. Stephen Jenner, Human Factors. And behind me in the second row, left to right, Jen Adler, Director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Tom McMurray, General Counsel for the NTSB. Michael Badinsky, Deputy Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. Carol Waldrop, Safety Recommendations. Andrew Dykestill, Technical Writer-Editor. Adrian Lamb, Materials Laboratory. Michael Portman, Vehicle Recorder Laboratory. And Zach Zagata, Operations. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the investigator in charge, Ruben Payan. Mr. Payan.
Good morning, Chair Homendy and members of the board. This morning, I will start with an overview of the accident investigation, followed by presentations from the group chairs in their specific investigative areas. On February 3rd, 2023, about 8:54 p.m., eastbound Norfolk Southern Freight Train 32N derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. The train consisted of 3 locomotives and 149 mixed freight rail cars, which included 20 placarded hazardous material tank cars. 17 of those tank cars were loaded and 3 were residue tank cars. The derailment involved 38 freight rail cars. Among the 38 derailed cars were 11 tank cars carrying flammable and combustible hazardous materials. 5 of these were DOT 105 specification tank cars and were carrying vinyl chloride monomer. The accident also involved 12 additional rail cars that did not derail but were damaged by the post-derailment fires. Emergency responders established a 1-mile evacuation zone that affected about 2,000 residents. Train 32N originated at the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis Yard in Madison, Illinois on February 1st, 2023. The train departed eastbound with a Norfolk Southern train crew and was destined for Conway Yard in Pennsylvania. On February 2nd, the train arrived in the Norfolk Southern Yard in Decatur, Illinois, where 55 rail cars were removed from the consist and an additional 40 rail cars were added to the rear of the train. One of the locomotives at the head of the train was also repositioned towards the middle of the train. Upon departure from Decatur later that same day, the train consists of 3 locomotives and 149 rail cars remained unchanged throughout the train's subsequent movements. The train arrived in Toledo, Ohio on February 3rd, where the accident crew, an engineer, a conductor, and a conductor trainee, went on duty. The accident crew conducted a briefing with the previous train crew and tested the train's brakes before departing. The train departed Toledo, Ohio, beginning the last leg of its trip before the derailment. After the accident, investigators obtained surveillance footage from private homes and local businesses that captured train's 32 ends movements covering a distance of more than 50 miles. In Salem, Ohio, about 26 miles from the point of derailment, surveillance footage recorded the train with the glow of a fire visible underneath the 23rd hopper car. As the train continued into Columbiana, Ohio, surveillance footage recorded the hopper car with a fire underneath the lead axle. This was about 10 miles from the point of derailment. About 4 miles from the point of derailment, surveillance footage recorded the train in New Waterford, Ohio, with fire and sparks underneath the same hopper car. Finally, in East Palestine, surveillance footage recorded the train showing a visible fire underneath the hopper car. As train 32N approached the point of derailment, the train encountered 3 wayside hot bearing defect detectors. Train 32N fully traversed the 2 defect detector locations at Sebring and Salem and began to traverse the East Palestine defect detector location when a critical alarm was received over the lead locomotive radio. The critical alarm reported axle 101 on the south rail, which corresponded to the left side bearing on the first axle of the 23rd rail car, the GPLX 75465 hopper car. Locomotive event recorder data indicated the train was traveling about 43 miles per hour at that time. After receiving the critical alarm, the train crew began to stop the train. According to the locomotive event recorder data, the engineer began to slow the train using dynamic braking before 8:54 p.m. Shortly afterward, as the train was still passing over the East Palestine hot bearing detector location, the train experienced a train line initiated emergency braking application. The head locomotives traveled about 1,670 feet before coming to a stop 38 seconds later. The crew radioed the Norfolk Southern Dispatch Center that it had experienced an emergency. The Norfolk Southern dispatcher confirmed the emergency at 8:56 p.m. and began coordinating train movements in the area to prevent other trains from colliding with train 32N. The NTSB investigation established that the following factors did not contribute to the accident. The track's condition and geometry near the derailment site did not show any defects that could have caused or contributed to derailment. The traffic control signal system and the positive train control system were functioning as designed at the time of the derailment. The crew of train 32N acted in accordance with Norfolk Southern operating rules, responding appropriately to both the bearing alarm and the derailment itself. The vinyl chloride monomer was loaded in a manner sufficient to stabilize the vinyl chloride monomer for transport and was shipped under the correct proper shipping name, UN 1086 vinyl chloride stabilized. The derailed hazardous material tank cars were not overloaded by weight or volume, and none of the 6 derailed DOT 105 tank cars sustained mechanical breaches during the derailment, including the 5 carrying vinyl chloride monomer, and none released lading except through the pressure relief device activity or the vent and burn operation. The investigation identified several safety issues in this accident: wheel bearing failures and detection, initial emergency response, hazardous material and tank car derailment performance, and the vent and burn operation. This is a list of the NTSB investigative staff that worked on the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment investigation. Additional NTSB investigative staff that also contributed to the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment are listed here. Parties to the NTSB investigation included the Federal Railroad Administration, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the Ohio State Highway Patrol, the Village of East Palestine, the Norfolk Southern Corporation, Trinity Industries Leasing Company, International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers. Parties to the investigation also included the International Association of Firefighters, Oxyvinyls LP, GATX Corporation, Midland Manufacturing, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, and the Transportation Communications Union, or Brotherhood of Railroad Carmen. In this accident, investigators were able to use head-in and inward-facing image recorder data that detailed the crew's activities and actions in the moments leading up to and during the derailment. Norfolk Southern, like most Class I railroads, have voluntarily installed these devices, but image and audio recorders are not required by FRA regulations for freight locomotives. For this investigation, Norfolk Southern only provided 20 minutes of data. The audio and video data that was provided demonstrated and confirmed that the train crew were alert and responded appropriately to the hot bearing alarm. Additionally, the data were instrumental in corroborating train crew statements. Previously issued recommendations regarding locomotive audio and image recorders were prompted by railroad accident investigations in which NTSB determined having inward and outward facing audio and image recorders would have provided crucial information that could have improved safety. Therefore, staff has proposed reiterating one recommendation to the Secretary of Transportation, 2 recommendations to the FRA, and 1 recommendation to the Class I railroads to install crash and fire protected inward and outward facing audio and image recorders with a minimum 12-hour continuous recording capability. This concludes my opening presentation. Next, Mr. Ryan and Mr. Scott will be presenting on wheel bearing failures and detection, followed by Mr. Lloyd, who will discuss the initial emergency response, and then Mr. Stansel will present on hazardous materials and tank car derailment performance issues and the vent and burn issues. Mr. Ryan.
Good morning. This presentation will cover the bearing failure and wayside detection systems. This is a cross-section depiction of a typical railroad freight car wheel and bearing. As you can see, typical components in this bearing include rollers, cages to align the rollers, and oil seal to retain the grease and protect it from environmental conditions. This bearing is pressed onto the end of the axle known as the journal. The weight of the car is supported by 8 bearings, 4 on each side of the car. Upon arrival, investigators found the #1 axle with the left #1 journal burnt off from the hopper car GPLX 75465 that was carrying plastic pellets. This car was the 23rd car from the front of the train of a total of 149 car consist. A healthy or undamaged journal is cylindrical in shape. High temperatures and a defective bearing typically twist the journal into a conical shape and then falls off, allowing the car to drop to the ground and in this case to derail. A teardown of the opposing bearing on the same axle was inconclusive, meaning no defective conditions were found that would indicate a possible bearing failure. The bearing had set in the fire and perishable evidence was destroyed, including the grease seals, the outer cage, and the grease. In Madison, Illinois, the train was mechanically inspected by qualified mechanical inspectors, also known as carmen, as required by federal regulations. In Decatur, Illinois, the added 40 cars were also inspected by qualified mechanical inspectors as required. The train then proceeded to East Palestine, Ohio, where the incident took place. Post-accident inspections revealed that about 25% of the cars had federal defective conditions. The train was headed in an easterly direction with the #1 axle leading. I am providing this slide as a visual indicator of the location of the left #1 wheel and a photograph of the actual hopper car involved in a graphic below. The NTSB investigated 2 other incidents that occurred on Norfolk Southern Railway after the East Palestine derailment that also had burnt-off journals. One in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, where a train traversed a hot bearing detector with a hot bearing, but the alert was not sent due to being miswired from earlier maintenance, and a journal burnt off and the train ultimately derailed. And in Elliston, Virginia, where a train crew received a hot bearing alarm after traversing a hot bearing detector, stopped and verified that the bearing was overheated, and proceeded forward, bypassing the first set-out location at track speed, where the bearing continued to overheat and ultimately burned off the journal and derailed. The mentioned cars with defective bearings from East Palestine, Newcastle, and Elliston had 3 similar findings. They were all axle position number 1. They were all bulk hopper service type cars, and all 3 also had reconditioned bearings. Currently, there is no national database to research historical trends. What we found was there are no standards pertaining to operational responses to bearing alerts and alarms. A bearing database capturing bearing failure and replacement information could help identify bearing failure risk factors. We are proposing one recommendation to the Federal Railroad Administration to establish rules governing railroads' operational responses to bearing failure warnings. We are proposing one recommendation to the Association of American Railroads to develop a database of bearing failures and replacements to help determine failure risk factors. Now, Greg Scott will cover wayside detection systems.
Thank you, Joey. Above is a basic view of a typical hot bearing detector location to show the different parts. On the top right, you have a signal bungalow where the internal electronic equipment is housed and all the external equipment is connected. The signal bungalow also contains an external temperature sensor that helps determine the external ambient temperature. On the bottom right, you have 2 transducers that are both mounted on the same rail. These are magnetic sensors used for counting axles and determining the direction of the train. These were the items in the Newcastle derailment that Mr. Ryan spoke of earlier that were wired incorrectly. On your top left, you will see a dragging equipment detector. These paddles are on a pivotable axle and are designed to sense anything that may be dragging from the train. Bottom left is an item of focus in this investigation. These are wheel bearing scanners that are located on both rails and designed to monitor bearing temperatures. The map you see is the last 3 hot bearing detectors the accident train 32N traversed. It passed the Sebring detector with no alerts or alarms. It then traveled approximately 10 miles and crossed the Salem hot bearing detector and sent an alert to the back office personnel due to the bearing being 103 degrees above ambient. The 32N then traveled approximately 20 miles to the East Palestine detector that alarmed on the 101st axle L1 bearing at 253 degrees above Fahrenheit, which is the maximum temperature that this equipment is able to detect. The train crew began to take appropriate action by slowing the train when it derailed before the train could come to a complete stop. After the East Palestine accident, the Association of American Railroads stated on March 8, 2023, in a key safety measures memo that all Class 1s had committed to an average spacing of 15 miles. As you can see here in this map, the detector spacing involved in this derailment already met the newly recommended average of 15-mile spacing. Pictured on the left is the 32N passing a surveillance camera with fire visible prior to reaching the Salem hot bearing detector. When the 32N passed through the Salem detector in this location, it only showed 103 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient air temperature, which was recorded at 11 degrees. We know fire burns hotter than 103 degrees above ambient, so in theory, the hot bearing detector should have shown a critical alarm. Instead, the detector sent a non-critical alert to the back office analyst. We believe the fire that was visible was the grease that had began to burn on the outside portion of the bearing and was not detected as a hotter temperature due to the scanner aimed at the inner portion of the bearing as shown in the figure on the right. During critical alarms, when a train is occupying a detector and a defect has been detected, an automatic radio transmission is sent to the train crew. A typical message will begin with an announcement of a critical alarm and repeat 3 times. It will then follow with a detector milepost location, followed by the words hot box, meaning excessively hot journal. The message will then indicate the exact axle of the alarm location and on which rail. A typical critical alarm message will sound like the following recording.
Critical alarm, critical alarm, critical alarm. Norfolk Southern milepost 91.9. Hot box axle 671 east rail.
After the train receives this message, it must immediately stop for an inspection consistent with safe train handling procedures. The Federal Railroad Administration has no regulations regarding critical alarms. The Association of American Railroads does have recommendations for an overheated bearing, which states a bearing is deemed overheated when it reaches 170 degrees Fahrenheit when identified by a hot bearing detector. Prior to the accident on February 3rd, Class 1 railroads temperatures for critical alarms ranged from 136 degrees Fahrenheit to 190 degrees Fahrenheit. After the accident on February 3rd, the Class 1 railroads temperatures ranged from 136 degrees Fahrenheit to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. To these limits, the Association of American Railroads have established as an overheated bearing reflect a safe operating temperature. We believe these temperature thresholds need to be researched and identify a proper, safe operating temperature. Alerts and alarms, such as the one from the Salem hot bearing detector, are sent to a back office analyst called an advanced train control analyst. The analyst monitors all alerts and alarms and follows standard operating procedures on when to take action. This analyst also communicates with train crews to help them determine the exact location on their train of any alert or alarm. Pictured above is a screen an analyst would see displayed. It is color-coded to help him quickly distinguish the severity of alerts and alarms, with red being the most severe. When the analyst chooses a particular hot bearing alert, this is the screen he may see displayed. This screen is of the alert the analyst saw of the non-critical alert from the Salem hot bearing detector. The top portion is comparing the bearing in question to the bearings in the train itself, the 32N. The bottom portion is the trending of that bearing from the other detectors the train has passed previously. Shown is axle 101, bearing L1 with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Per Norfolk Southern operating procedures, the analyst would simply monitor the first non-critical alert. Action is not required until 3 consecutive alerts are received that are above their threshold standards. Then the train is to be inspected when safe to do so, and delay can be minimized. Analysts would contact the crew via radio and instruct the crew of the situation and advise them to contact the dispatcher for a location to perform the inspections. Currently, the FRA has no regulations regarding temperature trending and alert limits. The Association of American Railroads does have recommendations for temperature trending and when a bearing is deemed overheated. Most Class 1s each have different protocols regarding temperature trending. Once again, do these limits need to be set at the Association of American Railroads definition of an overheated bearing or at a safe operating temperature? What we found in this investigation was first that the Salem hot bearing detector did not reflect the true temperature of the bearing. Second, that the internal bearing temperature likely exceeds external measured bearing temperatures. Third, the standard operating procedure limited the ability of the hot bearing detectors to measure a bearing's actual internal temperatures. And fourth, that the research is necessary to determine alarm and alert thresholds, distances between detectors, and review newer, more advanced technologies. And finally, that wayside bearing detectors should be subject to regulatory requirements for installation, inspection, and maintenance. We are proposing 3 recommendations to the Federal Railroad Administration. First, to research the effectiveness of current detection systems and identify minimum standards and make this research available to the public. Second, use the results from this research to establish minimum requirements for the use of the bearing defect detection systems. And third, establish requirements for installation, inspection, and maintenance of wayside bearing defect detectors. Now Troy Lloyd will cover the initial emergency response.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, Chair and members of the board. This presentation will discuss the following: the early emergency response timeline, including initial firefighting activities, State of Ohio firefighter training standards, the availability of train consist information, and tank car placard legibility and durability. The East Palestine Police and Fire Dispatch Center received the first 911 call at 8:56 p.m., reporting that a train had derailed with explosion and fire. The dispatch center radioed the East Palestine Fire Department at 8:58 p.m., requesting all available fire and emergency medical services units to respond. The fire department and the police department arrived on scene about 9 p.m. The East Palestine Police Department were first to arrive on scene and started evacuating homes near the burning tank cars. They also established control zones entering the incident site. The deputy fire chief arrived on scene a few minutes later. After assessing the incident scene, the deputy fire chief assumed the role of incident commander and established a command post at the Lake Oil property site adjacent to the derailment pileup and burning rail cars. The early emergency response at East Palestine focused on containing the fire and protecting residents near the derailment site. The incident commander instructed the fire dispatch center to use the emergency notification system to advise residents near the derailment to shelter in place. At about 11 p.m., Norfolk Southern personnel and contractors arrived on scene and started an assessment of the incident scene. They informed the incident commander of the dangers of having personnel operating near the burning rail cars. Also, about 11 p.m., residents within a 1-mile radius were ordered to evacuate the area. Developed by the United States Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the Emergency Response Guide is the go-to guide for emergency responders working at a hazardous materials incident site. The Emergency Response Guidebook helps personnel to quickly identify hazardous materials at an incident site, recognize the potential hazards associated with the hazardous materials, gather public safety guidance, and execute recommended emergency response guidance. The Emergency Response Guide supplies emergency responders with a yes-no decision tree matrix when referencing for hazardous materials. As shown, answering no to questions regarding UN numbers, material names, placards, or other missing identification indicators, the decision tree leads the emergency responder to the mixed load unidentified cargo page or Guide 111. Without referencing the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook, firefighters approached the pileup and began applying water to contain the fire, which grew rapidly. The correct guidance from the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook was the mixed load unidentified cargo or Guide 111 for a fire involving tank cars. The guide advises a 1/2 mile preliminary isolation and evacuation of the scene. While the firefighters acted in good faith to protect their community, the initial emergency response did not conform to the guidance for fires involving tank cars and unknown materials. In Ohio, volunteer firefighter training is mandated by state statute. A training course for a volunteer firefighter certificate is limited to 36 hours by statute, cannot include participation in training involving hazardous environments, and does not include training in hazardous materials response. The volunteer certification is classified as a support level training only. Fire chiefs or authorities having jurisdictions are responsible for providing additional training for volunteers that are expected to operate in hazardous environments. However, the NTSB is concerned that volunteer fire departments in the state of Ohio are called on to respond to the same incidents as their professional counterparts, as seen in this accident, but the volunteers may only have a fraction of the training Ohio and the NFPA require for professional firefighters. Firefighter 1 certification meets the minimum standard for professional firefighter professional qualifications established by the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, and recommended minimum level of certification to provide firefighting services in the state of Ohio. The course includes advanced firefighter training, hazardous materials awareness and operations level training, and training on the National Fallen Firefighters Association 16 life safety initiatives. In addition to the Firefighter 1 course, students are required to complete an emergency vehicle operations course and training on the National Incident Management System. Firefighter 2 is the highest level of firefighter certification available in Ohio. The Firefighter 2 certification is typically required for career firefighters in the state of Ohio. The certification meets the minimum requirements set forth in the Standard for Firefighter Professional Qualifications established by the NFPA as a qualifying level of public safety responder for trained firefighters. To be eligible for the Firefighter 2 certification, students shall successfully complete a combined 240-hour Firefighter 1 and Firefighter 2 course through an Ohio chartered training program, including training in emergency medical services. What we found was that the state of Ohio training requirements for volunteer firefighters did not meet the minimum NFPA Firefighter 1 standards. The Firefighter 1 standards include training in hazardous environments and training in hazardous materials response to the operations level. Therefore, staff proposes 2 recommendations. One, to the state of Ohio to amend its firefighter training statute and revise its volunteer firefighter certification standards to meet the National Fire Protection Association 1010 standard for professional firefighter qualifications. And one recommendation to the National Volunteer Fire Council, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the International Association of Firefighters to advise its members of the circumstances of the East Palestine train derailment and fire, identify volunteer fire departments whose personnel are not trained to the NFPA 1010 standard for professional firefighter qualifications, and recommend departments to adopt training that meets the standard, and inform them of funding opportunities through private, state, and federal programs. About 9 p.m., the East Palestine Fire and Police Dispatch called the Norfolk Southern Dispatch Center in Atlanta and requested consent information for Train 32N. The individual who answered the phone said that they would call back, but we did not find evidence of a return phone call. The Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency director received the train consent from Norfolk Southern via email about 10 p.m. The director then emailed the train consent to the East Liverpool fire chief, who was responding as the hazardous materials branch chief. The incident commander learned through phone conversation that the burning tank cars contained vinyl chloride monomer. After obtaining this information, all firefighters were instructed to evacuate the area, and the command post was relocated about 1 mile from the derailment site about midnight. The East Palestine fire chief arrived on scene about 2 a.m. on February 4th, assumed the role of incident commander, and obtained a copy of the train consist at the new command post. The delayed transmittal of the train consist increased the time emergency responders operated in the hot zone and delayed the recommended emergency response guidance evacuation distances. This resulted in greater exposure of emergency responders and to the public to post-derailment hazards. Ask Rail mobile app is a safety tool that provides first responders immediate access to accurate, timely data about what type of hazardous materials a rail car is carrying so they can make an informed decision about how to respond to a rail emergency. Ask Rail was designed to give first responders immediate information about rail cars carrying hazardous materials and be an invaluable tool for helping prepare those on the front line should a rail incident occur. Since the incident, the Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency has coordinated with NS and Ask Rail to provide training to each of the 5 county 911 centers on the use of the Ask Rail application. The NTSB has investigated other accidents involving train consist availability, including the July 10th, 2005 collision and derailment of 2 Canadian National Railway Company freight trains in Anding, Mississippi. The accident resulted in 4 train crew member fatalities, the release of 15,000 gallons of diesel fuel that burned for about 15 hours, and the evacuation of 100 residents. As a result of that accident, the NTSB recommended to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, with the assistance of the Federal Railroad Administration, require that railroads immediately provide to emergency responders accurate, real-time information regarding the identity and location of hazardous materials on a train. On July 24th of 2024, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration published a final rule titled Hazardous Materials Fast Act Requirements for Real-Time Train Consist Information. The rule requires all railroads transporting hazardous materials to maintain a separate electronic consist for hazardous material trains. The rule also requires railroads to immediately contact local emergency responders and provide them with consist information in the event of an accident involving a train carrying hazardous materials. Class 1 railroads have 1 year to comply to the rule. Class 2 and 3 railroads have 2 years. Despite the 9 p.m. request from East Palestine Fire Dispatch, Train 32N's consist information did not reach emergency responders until shortly before 10 p.m., when it was delivered as an email to one of the emergency response agencies. Not until about 11 p.m. at the recommendation of the Ohio State Patrol did the East Palestine Fire Department Deputy Fire Chief, acting as the incident commander, issue a 1-mile evacuation, the distance recommended by the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook for fire involving tank cars transporting vinyl chloride. About the same time, NS personnel and contractors began arriving on scene and recommending that firefighters redeploy to safer distances. Firefighters suspended fire suppression activities and relocated to safer positions around midnight on February 4th. Therefore, staff proposes one recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway, that it review and revise its policies to ensure that accurate train consist information is immediately available to emergency responders during an emergency. Staff also proposes the reclassification of one recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. With the assistance of the Federal Railroad Administration, require that railroads immediately provide to emergency responders accurate, real-time information regarding the identity and location of all hazardous materials on a train. Rail cars containing hazardous materials must be placarded in accordance with federal placard design requirements. These placards can assist emergency responders with identifying hazardous materials and safe response actions. As shown in the pictures, some placards were destroyed and could not be used to quickly identify the train's hazardous materials. Although placards must be capable of withstanding weather conditions, the federal design standard does not address derailments or fires. Placard requirements should include survivability sufficient to ensure that they are usable by emergency responders during rail transportation emergencies. When a shipping name or identification number cannot be associated with a tank car or other package during an emergency response, the Emergency Response Guidebook recommends reading placards from a safe distance to determine what protective measures are appropriate. Federal regulations require that placards must be capable of withstanding 30 days of exposure to open weather conditions without deterioration or a substantial reduction in effectiveness. The performance standard does not account for placard survivability during derailments or fire exposure. Therefore, staff proposes one recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to require that placards be able to survive fires and accidents and remain legible during such emergencies. This concludes my presentation. Next, Mr. Stanson will be presenting on hazardous materials.
Good morning, Chair Hamady and members of the board. My presentation will cover several additional hazardous material safety issues identified during the investigation, including those issues listed on this slide. The post-derailment fire likely began with a punctured DOT-111 tank car that released butyl acrylates, a Class 3 flammable liquid. This tank car sustained head punctures sizable enough to have rapidly released its contents, spilling the chemical along a 1,100-foot segment of track. The fire spread to other rail cars and combustible materials released from the train. DOT-111 tank cars are susceptible to breaching damage because the design does not typically include safety systems that have become standard for more robust specification tank cars, such as the DOT-117. These safety features include head shields, steel jackets, thermal protection systems, top fittings protection, and tanks fabricated from thicker, normalized steel for puncture resistance. Fire exposure from burning released lading caused pressure relief devices, or PRDs, to actuate on intact DOT-105 tank cars carrying vinyl chloride. This led to Norfolk Southern and its contractors voicing concerns about vinyl chloride polymerization. The events that eventually led to the vent and burn action could have been avoided had there been no DOT-111 tank cars carrying combustible and flammable liquids on this train. In accordance with the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or FAST Act, which requires phase-out of flammable liquids tank cars not meeting minimum DOT-117 performance specifications, The damaged DOT-111 tank car that released butyl acrylates in this derailment would no longer have been authorized for transportation in flammable liquids service after May 1st, 2029. The East Palestine derailment has prompted calls for accelerating the pace of the DOT-111 phase-out mandate. While industry acknowledges the capacity to accomplish an accelerated phase-out, a recent Federal Railroad Administration report found that economic disincentives could make this unlikely under voluntary action. In addition, the Secretary of Transportation does not have discretion to change the compliance dates. Staff has therefore proposed a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to seek legislative authority for an accelerated phase-out of DOT-111 tank cars in flammable liquids service. The FAST Act does not require non-pressure tank cars used to transport combustible and other flammable materials to meet DOT-117 specifications. Of the 3 DOT-111 tank cars that were breached in this accident, 2 of them were carrying combustible liquids, which were not subject to the FAST Act's phase-out. Based on their long history of poor derailment crashworthiness and an unacceptable safety record, the presence of DOT-111 tank cars in a mixed freight train increases the probability of lading releases from other, more robust tank cars. Therefore, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to establish a replacement program for tank cars not meeting DOT-117 tank car safety standards. During the emergency response to this derailment, Norfolk Southern and its contractors cited polymerized vinyl chloride monomer, or VCM, affecting the proper function of the tank car pressure relief devices as their reason for advocating vent and burn actions. This prompted NTSB investigators to conduct post-derailment examinations of the tank car service equipment. The examinations found evidence of lading incompatibility with certain components, including some pressure relief devices that were corroded and seized. These components did not withstand the effect of corrosive gases produced by vinyl chloride. Aluminum-coated pressure relief device valve springs that had been significantly deteriorated. The vinyl chloride manufacturer's safety data sheet states that the material is incompatible with aluminum and reactions with this substance can be strongly exothermic. The protective housing covers of 3 vinyl chloride tank cars made from aluminum melted and allowed the aluminum to re-solidify onto pressure relief device components. Aluminum has a much lower melting point compared with steel and is susceptible to thermal damage. These photographs show the accumulation of aluminum in the pressure relief device structures, which must remain free of debris to ensure adequate venting capacity. The thermally destroyed and missing protective housing covers shown in this photograph led to metallic debris accumulating in the pressure relief device. Aluminum valve hand wheels were also destroyed, hampering any attempt to unload the tank cars through normal means. Although the use of aluminum components rendered the tank cars susceptible to thermal damage, there was insufficient evidence in this incident to determine whether this contributed to the release of hazardous materials. To ensure that tank car safety equipment components meet safety requirements, the manufacturer provides designs to the Association of American Railroads, or AAR, for approval. Although federal regulations require the pressure relief devices to be made of materials compatible with the lading such that they have sufficient flow capacity to prevent tank overpressure during a fire, the AAR does not conduct independent testing, reference relevant scientific literature, or require demonstrations of manufacturers' representations. Therefore, the approval process lacks a means of verifying the equipment will perform in service as required. Because this incomplete review process may create safety hazards that could be avoided by more careful reviews, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to the Association of American Railroads for establishing criteria to demonstrate tank car service equipment lading compatibility. Additionally, staff proposes one safety recommendation to the Federal Railroad Administration for oversight of the recommended AAR action and to use its regulatory authority to address weaknesses in the service equipment approval process. Federal regulations prescribe operational requirements for high-hazard flammable trains, or HHFTs, that are designed to mitigate derailments in trains carrying large quantities of flammable liquids. Safety benefits of the regulation are derived from special routing, incident planning, speed restrictions, braking, and requirements for the use of more survivable tank cars. These requirements currently pertain to trains containing 20 or more loaded Class 3 flammable liquids tank cars in a single block, or 35 such tank cars distributed throughout a train. Train 32N was not defined as a high-hazard flammable train because it contained only 2 applicable flammable liquids tank cars. The post-derailment fires in East Palestine were similar to scenarios the high-hazard flammable train rules were intended to prevent, and also demonstrate that mixed freight trains carrying flammable gases and combustible liquids are also vulnerable to cascading fires and hazardous materials releases. Thus, the probability of a fire-induced cascading hazardous materials release depends in part on variations in tank car survivability and on the presence of additional flammabilities other than Class 3 flammable liquids. Staff proposes a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for revising the high-hazard flammable train regulatory definition to include additional hazardous materials and subject these requirements to fewer numbers of applicable tank cars in a train. The Association of American Railroads defines key train in Circular OT 55, which establishes recommended operating practices for the transportation of hazardous materials. Key train definitions include 20 carloads or intermodal portable tank loads of any combination of hazardous material and fewer numbers of rail cars when certain commodities such as poisonous or radioactive materials are present in a train. Key trains are restricted to a 50-mile-per-hour maximum speed. If a key train wheel bearing defect is reported by a wayside detector, but a visual inspection fails to confirm the defect, the train must not exceed 30 miles per hour until it is passed over the next detector or delivered to a terminal for mechanical inspection. Cars with confirmed defects must be set out from the train. Because the train only contained 17 loaded hazardous materials cars, Train 32N contained too few hazardous materials cars to classify it as a key train under current definitions. The protective requirements for key trains provided in Circular OT 55 should account for the elevated risk posed by the presence of DOT 111 tank cars carrying hazardous materials. Staff therefore proposes a recommendation to the Association of American Railroads to designate as key trains any train transporting hazardous materials and tank cars that do not meet or exceed DOT 117 safety standards. On February 4th, about 5:30 p.m., Norfolk Southern and its contractors observed an unusually energetic release of burning vapor from the pressure relief device of one of the vinyl chloride tank cars. Norfolk Southern contractors SPSI and SRS interpreted the incident as a sign that vinyl chloride had polymerized and obstructed the tank car pressure relief device. This energetic pressure relief device actuation of a 70-minute duration, followed by cessation of activity, marked their first consideration for the need to conduct vent and burn actions. During his post-incident interview, the SPSI president remarked, "We are already there at a vent and burn in our minds." Federal regulations require hazardous materials shippers to provide comprehensive emergency response information for materials they offer into transportation. Beginning on the morning of February 4th, Norfolk Southern and its contractors communicated with OxyVinyls, the vinyl chloride manufacturer and shipper. On February 5th, OxyVinyls deployed 3 experts to the derailment scene. In its communications with Norfolk Southern and its contractors, OxyVinyls assessed a low probability of dangerous polymerization given the condition of the intact tank cars. And they recommended monitoring the tank car temperatures for evidence of exothermic polymerization reactions. OxyVinyls further explained that the vapor pressure within the tank cars, the vinyl chloride tank cars, would only reach the level necessary to actuate pressure relief devices when the lading temperature reached 185 degrees Fahrenheit. OxyVinyls also advised Norfolk Southern that because the tank cars were not breached and were therefore under positive pressure, oxygen could not have entered the tanks to destabilize the vinyl chloride and promote polymerization. Contrary to OxyVinyl's technical advice, Norfolk Southern and its contractors interpreted tank car temperatures as signs of dangerous polymerization. While the temperature of 4 tank cars remained stable, the downward trend in tank shell temperature on a 5th tank car should have prompted a pause in proceeding with the vent and burn action based on their understanding the chemical reactivity was related to the tank car temperature. Instead of the cooling temperature trend shown on this slide, a runaway polymerization reaction would have produced a rapid and sustained exponential temperature increase. The observed temperature trend in tank car OCPX 80370 shown on this chart is not indicative of a polymerization reaction. Curiously, Norfolk Southern's manager of hazardous materials told NTSB investigators that according to OxyVinyls, if the tank car shell temperature had risen to a critical temperature of 185 degrees Fahrenheit, a runaway polymerization reaction would have ensued. This is incorrect because, as OxyVinyls explained, 185 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature at which the vapor pressure would have been sufficient to actuate pressure relief devices. This erroneous runaway polymerization statement suggests a misunderstanding or confusion between OxyVinyl's technical support team and Norfolk Southern's expert contractors. As the intensity of the fires reduced, Norfolk Southern contractors interpreted the cessation of pressure relief device actuations as evidence they had become blocked with the formation of polymer. However, this was most likely because tank car temperatures were too low to produce sufficient vapor pressure to actuate them, or the lading had become depleted by their earlier pressure relief venting. Despite this contradictory evidence, Norfolk Southern and its contractors continued to assert the necessity of a vent and burn, even though available evidence should have led them to reevaluate their initial conclusions. Tank car loading records confirmed the vinyl chloride had been stabilized by oxygen removal. The tank cars remained under positive pressure until the vent and burn, preventing the infiltration of oxygen and other contaminants that could have promoted polymerization reactions. Examination of the internal PRD, or pressure relief device components, recovered from the tank cars found no evidence of polymer obstructions that would have affected their function. This lack of solidified matter within the service equipment cavities does not indicate a polymerization reaction occurred within the tank cars. Available scientific information and evidence suggests the vinyl chloride did not undergo polymerization, and the vent and burn action therefore would not have been necessary to prevent a polymerization-induced tank car rupture. Nevertheless, a PHMSA hazardous materials incident report database query found that Norfolk Southern reported polymerization as the cause of the package failures for the 5 vinyl chloride tank cars. Staff proposes one recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway to revise its incident report to accurately reflect the package failure cause. Oxyvinyls had no direct interaction with the East Palestine Fire Chief Incident Commander or with elements of the Incident Command other than Norfolk Southern and its contractors, SPSI and SRS. Their technical information and conclusions about the lack of dangerous vinyl chloride polymerization were not relayed to the Incident Commander, and the Incident Commander was not aware that Oxyvinyls was available as a source of expertise. The Incident Commander approved the vent and burn action based on information provided by Norfolk Southern, SPSI, and SRS in 2 meetings with the Incident Command staff. However, Norfolk Southern and its contractors, who were in control of the derailment scene assessment, compromised the integrity of the vent and burn decision by withholding complete and accurate expert opinions and information from the Incident Commander. Further, the Incident Commander could have made a better informed decision about the vent and burn action had Oxyvinyls been a participant in the Incident Command meetings. Vent and burn is a seldom used procedure using explosives to breach tank car shells to safely reduce the internal vapor pressure to decrease the potential for sudden tank failure. This procedure also empties the contents of the tank to facilitate disposal of the chemical by burning. The vent and burn method should only be used when there is a high probability of catastrophic tank shell failure. Several mitigation options were considered and rejected in favor of the vent and burn. An alternative option to allow the tank cars to finish cooling while then taking time to complete detailed damage assessments was overlooked. The pattern of dismissing contradictory evidence while interpreting ambiguous evidence in support of Norfolk Southern's and its contractors' original belief was consistent with confirmation bias, a tendency to gather evidence that confirms pre-existing expectations while dismissing or failing to seek contradictory evidence. Whatever the underlying explanations were for the continued support of a vent and burn action, none justifies failing to communicate accurate and complete information, including dissenting expert opinions, to the Incident Command. Staff has proposed a safety recommendation to Norfolk Southern to address accurate communications with incident commanders. Sources of vinyl chloride hazard information that Norfolk Southern and its contractors referenced while forming initial judgments about the potential for catastrophic tank rupture included the Chlorine Institute Pamphlet 171. This pamphlet provides guidance for safe handling and emergency response for vinyl chloride transported in rail cars and contains information related to polymerization hazards. Among the communications regarding vinyl chloride hazards, the pamphlet states that at a pressure above 68 psi-G or a tank surface temperature above ambient may be indicative of polymerization. These statements do not take into consideration other explanations of elevated temperatures and pressures and can lead the reader to incorrectly conclude that polymerization is occurring. Expert testimony at the NTSB investigative hearing, scientific and historical evidence indicate that thermal initiation of dangerous vinyl chloride polymerization in the absence of an initiator compound is unlikely in a tank car transportation scenario. Thus, pamphlet 171 overstates the probability of polymerization in these circumstances, which can lead to erroneous mitigation actions. Staff proposes a safety recommendation to the Chlorine Institute to revise safety messages contained in pamphlet 171 regarding the risk of polymerization in a rail accident. The Chlorine Institute's ChlorEP contractor program provides for the availability of expert incident mitigation contractors who meet qualifications for addressing incidents involving certain chlor-alkali industry products, such as vinyl chloride monomer. The Chlorine Institute audits ChlorEP contractors every 3 years to verify they possess necessary capabilities. Norfolk Southern Railway employed 2 of the only 3 available Level 3 ChlorEP contractors for its response to East Palestine. Level 3 contractors are supposed to be the most highly qualified, possessing the capability to conduct field transfers and take advanced mitigating actions on severely damaged tank cars. Vent and burn action is not among the specific capabilities addressed by these qualifications. Norfolk Southern contractors did not correctly interpret evidence relevant to vinyl chloride polymerization, nor did they recognize the limitations of written hazard communications or make use of expert opinions contrary to their assumptions. Level 3 ChlorEP contractors should possess advanced technical knowledge to accurately assess chemical hazards for the commodities covered under this program, while providing accurate hazard information to incident commanders. Thus, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to address ChlorEP contractor training and verification of capabilities. Tank car temperature information recorded on scene by emergency response contractors, the timing of pressure relief device actuations, and indicators of hazardous polymerization are all relevant to the accuracy of emergency response guidance. This information collected during the response to this incident is a vital resource in ensuring that hazardous materials guidance is supportive of emergency response actions. Thus, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway to address policies for contractors to keep detailed records and share information used to make emergency response decisions. In 1994 and in 2007, the Federal Railroad Administration published reports about the vent and burn method for tank cars, in which it recognizes it is a valid but high-risk procedure to be used only as a last resort for certain flammable liquefied compressed gases. These reports contain guidance for how an incident command should approach such a decision. However, the guidance could be improved with more comprehensive information regarding what products are appropriate for vent and burn action, what hazards may result, and an intuitive decision tree to aid first responders who may consider employing the method. At the time of the East Palestine incident, the incident commander was not aware of the report's existence and would not have had access to it because it had been marked sensitive security information. Recently, the Federal Railroad Administration lifted the security restrictions for these reports and published them on its website. Although a vent and burn action was not necessary in East Palestine to prevent a polymerization-induced catastrophic tank rupture, such action could be appropriate under different circumstances. Therefore, the significant impact of a vent and burn action to a community demonstrates the need for widely available federal guidance on what circumstances and what products are warranted for the procedure. Staff has proposed 3 recommendations to the Federal Railroad Administration to address the need for updated and more comprehensive vent and burn guidance and for increasing its availability to emergency response agencies. 1 recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for distribution of the guidance, and 1 recommendation to the International Association of Fire Chiefs, International Association of Firefighters, and the National Volunteer Fire Council to inform their membership of the circumstances surrounding the vent and burn and the availability of the federal guidance. Chair Hamady, this concludes staff's presentations.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your excellent presentations. We're going to take a break till 11:05. It's about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and go to the question rounds. For the community's preparation and those watching, we'll have 30-minute break for lunch from about 12:30 to 1. That's approximate, depending on how we're going. And we'll do another 15-minute break around 3 o'clock. But we will be back at 11:05 and start promptly at that point. Thank you. Again, I want to thank the staff for their excellent presentations. We are going to turn to board member questions focused on 4 key safety issues identified in this investigation. First, wheel bearings failures and detection. Second, initial emergency response. Third, hazardous materials and tank car derailment performance. Fourth, vent and burn. Members have had the draft report since May 17th and have had discussions with staff and have asked questions. The purpose of this discussion and focused deliberation is to highlight those areas where we believe we can make the biggest difference to improve safety. Members are reminded to limit their questions to the specific safety issue at hand. We found that it helps the public better follow the discussion. We're going to limit questions to 2 rounds. By my calculation, that gives us about an hour per section plus about 30 minutes for a catch-all round for anything that is not in these 4 areas. And we'll see if there is time left over under one section, we'll carry it over to the next section. And again, we'll have a catch-all round at the end. We're going to begin our discussion on wheel bearings failures and detection. Member Graham is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start with just kind of the beginning, if we could. Like when I came up here with the investigative team, we know the derailment occurred at milepost 49.5. Can you please discuss how the investigative team determined the exact point of derailment like you did for me on that Sunday?
Yeah, so when we arrived post-derailment, there was marks on the rail that would indicate that the truck frame from the hopper car had fallen onto the rail, showing scrape marks. When the opposing wheel derailed from the opposing track, it made flange marks into the ties, indicating that that's the point of derailment.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to jump to the L1 bearing damage assessment. What impact, if any, did the reconditioning of the L1 bearing have on this derailment?
The findings on our teardown were inconclusive, meaning that generally when a bearing gets hot and burns off the journal, it gets destroyed in the process. This was a reconditioned bearing. Reconditioned bearings have about half the life of a new bearing. The opposing bearing was tore down, as it's the closest exemplar bearing that would possibly be in the same type of service as the bearing that burnt off. So that bearing was tore down, and it was also inconclusive because it was in the pool fire for a long period of time, and perishable evidence was destroyed, including the seal, the grease, and one of the internal components. The cage was also burnt and melted and missing.
So I think it's good for the public to know, is it uncommon to have a reconditioned bearing on a freight car or a tank car?
A majority of the bearings on freight cars are reconditioned bearings. Because
the life of a car goes for how long? 30, 40, 50 years sometimes?
The life of the car?
A life of a car?
Yeah, you were correct.
So it's not uncommon for an unconditioned or a reconditioned bearing on a car.
Yes.
You did talk about 2 other investigations we're doing in Newcastle and Elliston that occurred as a result of failed reconditioned bearing. Are we able to determine any commonalities or trends across the 3 derailments?
Yeah, so those 3 derailments, they were all burnt off journals due to bearing defects, and the commonalities were they were all on axle position 1, they were all reconditioned bearings, and they were all in hopper car bulk type service.
Okay. So how would a database of bearing failures support the identification of trends and underlying commonalities?
So after these 3 incidents occurred, our attempt to try to search the industry for this type of data to try to stratify any data to analyze why or when or which type of bearings and what kind of service they're in take place, and that database doesn't exist. So things that we could look for would be the mileage on the bearings, the type of service that it's in, if they were reconditioned or not, who the reconditioner was, and more items.
Okay. I know AAR currently maintains a database, but what do they maintain as far as a database, and would this be a good starting point for a better database of bearing failures?
Yeah, so that type of data is recorded through the AAR in an application called RailLink, and the type of the information that they keep is the mileage of the bearing, when the bearing and the wheels were pressed onto the axle, where it took place, the type of car that it was applied to. So the data exists, but it doesn't exist in one database. So you can find it on a car per car basis, but not as an industry-wide database.
Okay. I noticed AAR, they define overheater bearing based on what makes a rail car repair billable to a rail car owner or leaser. Considering the limitations and everything like that, is this basis of AAR's definition of an overheated bearing appropriate to prevent derailments?
That's one reason that we recommend to have a database to accumulate that data.
Okay, thank you. I see my time.
Thank you. Member Chapman is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on that discussion, so to clarify, the recommendation that's being proposed that we'll consider later today is for the Federal Railroad Administration to develop such a database, correct?
The recommendation is to the American Association of Railroads, or Association of American Railroads, excuse me.
Understand. So AAR rather than FRA.
Yes, sir.
Based on your experience and our knowledge and understanding of these things, what are the typical root causes of a bearing failure?
Bearing failures most commonly fail due to age-related phenomenon like wear or fatigue of components or loss or breakdown of lubrication. If they fail earlier, not due to aging, it can fall into 3 categories. Dynamic components that stop moving. So, for instance, if a roller skews or seizes, any stationary components that actually start moving, which can occur when you have excessive end play on your assembly, or you can have contamination of your lubrication, which can occur if you have those wear particles from the components, or you get water ingress into the bearing.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to ask a couple questions about inspections. I understand that the derailed hopper car was last visually inspected on February 1st in Madison. And that inspection, I believe, was a regulatory inspection. It's called 49 CFR 215. That's the regulation. That was a regulatory mechanical inspection. What does that sort of inspection, that sort of regulatory inspection involve?
Part 215, 49 CFR Part 215 is identified as railroad freight car safety standards, and it basically, in a nutshell, covers the running gear, the frame of the car, and coupler and draft systems.
And if the defect or the root cause of this bearing failure was internal, would that sort of inspection have caught it?
It's possible. It's unlikely. Most of the damage occurs inside of the bearing, and it's not visually seen. Could we please pull up slide 103? So this, you can see the bearing from different angles, and you can see that there's a bearing adapter on top of the bearing, and the truck also surrounds it. So visually, you can't see a lot of the bearing. So indicators would be grease leaking out. Could we move to slide 104, please? This is showing how grease, due to a damaged seal, leaks from a bearing. These are visual indicators that the bearing could be getting ready to fail.
So there are physical limitations to detecting a bearing failure if it's internal. But in addition to that, there are some time constraints too. The draft report makes mention of a target time of 90 seconds per rail car for inspections. I mean, is 90 seconds sufficient target time frame for conducting adequate regulatory mechanical inspections?
Yeah, so the time limit, the time limits that are put on inspections per car is not regulatory. It's what railroads impose on themselves and their own employees. And it's variable. It depends on the type of car. Some cars, for example, tank cars and this hopper car, the truck systems and the running gear are exposed and easily looked at. Some other type of cars, special construction and auto racks, are a lot harder to see because the running gear system is covered by the body of the coupler, or I mean the body of the car. So some cars, yes, 90 seconds is plenty of time. Some cars, no, that's not enough time.
And the 90 seconds referenced in the draft report is that relates to Norfolk Southern, I believe.
Yes.
Is that sort of time constraint, that time target, is that fairly typical within the industry?
It depends on the location, and also other variables would include the terrain, the yard setup, the fitness of the inspector, the knowledge of the inspector. It's variable. And I inspected cars in my previous position, and I could inspect a car in 90 seconds most of the time. Sometimes I couldn't. If you have to stop and make measurements using gauges or other tools, then it takes longer.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Member Brown is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Pion, and your team for an extensive, excellent work on this report. We know not all bearing failures are catastrophic or sudden, like this one in East Palestine. What are some of the typical failures you've seen in freight car bearings?
Well, as I mentioned before, the typical ones most commonly seen are the age-related. So due to wear of components, or fatigue of components when they wear out and break and spall, or breakdown of lubrication. Otherwise, it is something to do with the assembly, causing dynamics components to stop moving or static components to start moving, like end play, or there's some sort of contamination, water ingress, or those worn components are causing contamination of the lubrication, which is spreading throughout the rest of the bearing.
Okay. Can you talk a bit more about the new bearing detection technology and how it may impact safety?
Yeah, so there's a couple newer technologies that I know of being looked at. One is onboard technology. It's actually mounted to the bearings themselves. It gives real-time data as the train moves on. Some of the companies are using vibration, I believe. Some are using a thermal system. So you would get an onboard real-time inspection of the train, essentially. And it's not based on spacing of a wayside detector or whatever. There are some, say, limitations, but there are some hurdles in making this type of technology happen. When you're talking about wayside detection goes towards the railroad, so it's easily accomplished. When you go towards individual cars and mounting a detector on individual cars, each individual bearing, then you're talking about car owners, and the majority of the rail cars on the system are not owned by Class 1 railroads or the railroads. So then you have to make sure that everybody uses the same technology. It's interoperable between all the Class 1s or all the railroads they traverse. So and then you have to have power to a car, communications to a car. So in my opinion, would be a better technology, but there's a lot of hurdles to make it happen.
Okay. In this instance, we know that the hot bearing detectors did not signal the early moments of the freight car bearings becoming compromised. Can you talk about the life expectancy of these detectors and whether the age of the ones in the track near East Palestine has been an issue?
There's not a standard life expectancy on the typical hot bearing detectors that are in place now. The external components, it just is more of an environmental factor, or if there's a newer technology. Internal, as far as like the programming, it is more of a real-time thing. If there's a newer software version out, that can be loaded into the detectors immediately. They have communication through the detectors, and they can push that software standardization through with no problem. So there's not a standard life expectancy per se on that type of equipment.
Okay. I'd like to follow up on the acoustic detectors and clarify. Will these be replacing the hot bearing detectors, or should they both be used in tandem? Why or why not?
In my personal opinion, I don't think they could replace hot bearing detectors. I definitely think it's a step in the right direction as you're being a pro, taking a proactive stance, and you're trying to find defects before the bearing actually fails. But we also know that bearings can fail within a minute or two. So I believe it's something that may have to be used in tandem.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Brown. Member Inman is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. And it's I hadn't had a chance to meet the people of East Palestine. As you know, we weren't here for the investigative hearing, so I appreciate everything. I actually came from a town smaller than yours, 3,000 people, and it had 16 chemical manufacturers in that town. So I know what it's like for the railroads to come through, and you forget what it even sounds like until something happens. I'll start with Ruben. Does the FRA ever audit inspection practices or the associated manuals and training that go with these inspections that we're talking about?
For mechanical inspections?
Yes.
I'll actually let Mr. Ryan. He's
I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat your question?
Does the FRA ever audit the inspection practices or the manuals and the training and how they're done through railroads?
Yes, the FRA does follow-up inspections on equipment and also their training. That is true.
And they're verifying that these inspections are occurring to the prescriptive language?
Yes, they do.
Okay. Is there a standard operating system, a standard operators use to determine what constitutes an alarm versus an alert based on hot bearing data?
There's not a standard throughout the Class 1s as far as a alarm. That's a critical when a bearing has failed. As far as the alerts, they're trying to predict when a bearing may fail. I think most Class 1s or most railroads typically start off with the AAR recommendations as a starting point, and then they may tweak them one way or the other to get rid of erroneous alarms, but still keeping the parameters of finding critical failures.
Do we have any data on the number of critical hot bearing detector alerts or alarms Norfolk Southern or any other operators receive in a year?
I'm not sure a year. I know when we interviewed the analyst, he said it was not uncommon to get, several hundred per shift, and I think he said he may even get up to 300 or so per shift. Now, I will say when we talk about alerts and the analysts getting those, not all those are bearing alerts. So I think it was only 5% of those alerts were bearing alerts. I think it was in the 50s or maybe 60% was hot wheel alerts, which is most of the time a braking issue. And I think 50-some%, I don't know the exact number, but it was a one-time alert and it never re-alerted again, so it was a single occurrence.
And in this instance, in your presentation, you said that the wayside desk did not receive it?
They did receive the alert. The analysts had not had time to review the alert. So they did receive an alert from the Salem hot bearing detector. It did go in the system. It was in the analyst queue, but he had not reviewed it yet. Had he saw it, per their SOPs, he wouldn't have had to take any action on it. He would have just monitored it, because in the trending you need to trend with more than one location. So he would have monitored that first alert to see if a second or third alert came in.
And all this is typically based around whether they can bill for a repair or not based on their trade association?
I think they start off with the Association of American Railroads guidance with their recommendations, and then each Class 1, as far as trending goes, They vary. The alarm limits are a little bit closer together, but as far as the trending, at the time of the East Palestine derailment, each Class 1 varied.
So following up on the wayside desk again, I mean, as I understand it, there's no law requiring wayside desks per se.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
So how are standards kind of put together about the staffing if you're talking about 300 alerts in a shift?
It's all dependent on the railroad and what their, I guess, their standard operating procedures are, the budget they have. I'm not sure how they determine that.
So they get to make their own rules?
As far as that, yes, sir.
Did we look into anything regarding single-person staffing? I know that was in the Norfolk Southern. Did we
Yes,
look
sir.
at it?
They at the time of the derailment, they had before the derailment, I think they had multiple analysts. At the time of the derailment, they only had one analyst on per shift with a supervisor occasionally that could fill in if the analyst got overwhelmed. Post East Palestine, they have two analysts per shift on every shift. And my understanding is they're trying to go to 3 analysts per shift because of the added defect detectors and acoustic detectors that they've added to the system since
Okay.
this.
Thank you.
Question, I'm just going to pick up on that for a second. On the ATC desk, they had more people. They were down to 1 plus a supervisor. Now they've brought people back at Norfolk Southern. One question on, I thought it was interesting in the interview, what did the ATC desk person, did they get a lunch break?
They did, but at the time, nobody monitored. I mean,
They actually didn't. He said numerous times there's not an allowance for a lunch break,
Yeah.
but he would run down, get his lunch, come back, and at that point, it wasn't really staffed.
Right.
It would be flashing, and if they came back, then they would take care of any alerts.
That's correct.
No lunch break, no bathroom break.
Right.
They'd have to run down and then come back.
Yeah.
Which I think
Yes,
is certainly not a way to run a railroad. Question, hot bearing detectors are certainly the primary defense against failures.
Yes, ma'am.
The railroad industry has been using it for a number of years, tracking temperatures. They're set not really based on science, not really based on standards. We have some recommendations that we're going to talk about a little bit later that you talked about in your opening presentation. I just want to highlight, and I want you to take the time as much as you need, probably Joey or Greg. How does a bearing that was on fire only read 103 degrees Fahrenheit over the Salem hot bearing detector and 253 degrees over the East Palestine hot bearing detector? And maybe you can talk about how that occurs inside and then comes outward.
I'll let Joey start off or
Great.
Adrian with the internal.
So the bearing starts to heat up due to a defect inside, causing friction, which causes heat, and then it takes time for the heat to propagate to the external part of the bearing, similar to putting an iron skillet on your stove. It has to be there for a couple minutes before it actually is ready.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because Professor Tarawan, who testified at our hearing, actually said once it starts, it could take 30 minutes to an hour before that occurs. 30 minutes to an hour. One other question, and I know Adrian, Ms. Lamb had mentioned failures for bearings, which could include water ingress. We don't have any. We weren't able to determine the cause of the failure due to the extensive damage. But that is one. We know that this car was in locations where there was substantial flooding. We don't have any evidence of water ingress causing that failure. I do have a question on whether the bearing was replaced after it was sitting in those flooded areas. Do we have any evidence showing it was replaced?
No, there's no evidence of that.
And I will just note that Timken, the manufacturer, and the Association of American Railroads recommend that it be replaced when sitting in flooded areas to prevent failure. So we don't have any evidence of that, but it is another cause of problems. I guess one question I have is, if you're a railroad, how do you know? How do you know, because you don't own that car? You pick up a car. How do you know that it was either sitting in a flooded area, that it hasn't been replaced?
Yeah, typically a person would have to visually see it and then take action.
Yeah, thank you. What's the service life of a remanufactured bearing?
Well, we know that the service life of a reconditioned bearing is half of a new one. The bearings are designed to last longer than the life of a wheel. When a wheel is replaced, the bearings come off, and once the bearing's removed, it's required to be reconditioned before being reapplied to another axle.
And what was the service life on this wheel bearing in particular? Or how many miles did it have on it?
Yeah, so this bearing was pressed, or this wheel set, including the bearing, was pressed together in 2011. It was applied to this car in 2012 and had a little over 50,000 miles on it.
Thank you very much. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. We know that the wayside detector alarm criteria and configurations and maintenance vary across the Class 1 railroads, and undoubtedly wayside bearing defect detectors have prevented numerous derailments. But what factors determine the success in hot box detectors preventing derailments?
I'd have to say, first of all, the proper installation and maintenance of those particular detectors, whether they're maintained regularly, if they're maintaining them properly, and then as far as, we need to have the proper alarm and alert levels to be able to accurately detect something before a derailment.
Okay. What is the single most common cause of mechanical derailments on railroads?
That would be failing bearings.
Failed bearings, yeah. And I see over the past 4 years, we're averaging over 17 overheated journal bearing accidents every year, making it the single most common mechanical cause of accidents. Yet there is no industry consensus on regulation that specifies the appropriate spacing, maintenance, or alarm threshold criteria. Can you discuss the post-derailment remedial actions reported by Norfolk Southern to increase the number of hot box detectors and reduce the average distance between them?
Yeah, so prior to East Palestine, Norfolk Southern did have one of the lower averages. They typically use an average spacing and not actual spacing, not just Norfolk Southern, but all railroads. So they had one of the lower averages amongst the Class 1s. To my knowledge, they've added well over 100 hot bearing detectors, and they've added, I think they went from 5 acoustics to 17 or 18 acoustics across their system now, and I think they have plans to add a few more.
Great. I know Member Brown talked a little bit about the acoustic detectors and all, but I see that Norfolk Southern has installed its first multi-scan hot bearing detector in December of 23. And how does that new technology attempt to overcome the limitations of the current hot bearing detectors?
So I believe not only Norfolk Southern, but I believe all Class 1s right now are running kind of a beta test on this multi-scan or multi-beam, I've heard it called, where, if you remember the slide where it showed the one beam, the one scan area on the bearing on the inner portion, this multi-scan will scan up to, I think some of them do up to 8 different areas on the bearing that covers from the inner portion to the outer portion. So essentially they're trying to look at the entire bearing all the way across.
Okay, thank you. And I'd see that Norfolk Southern has reported piloting a thermal camera program in its Inman yard in Atlanta. How do thermal cameras identify overheated bearings and attempt to overcome the limitations of the current hot bearing detectors?
So they take a thermal image of the bearing when it passes by, so the entire visible portion of the bearing, and through the thermal cameras, it's a little more accurate of the internal. You probably get a little more accuracy of the internal temperatures of the bearing versus just scanning the bottom portion of the bearing.
Do we have any idea how the other Class 1 railroads are reacting to this?
I think, especially since East Palestine, I'm not saying that there was silos before, but I don't think as much information was shared prior to East Palestine since then. I've spoken to the Class 1s, and there's a lot of information being shared, and I believe most of them are beta testing the same equipment, trying to look for newer technologies, better technologies.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Joe. Just a couple of additional questions here. Regarding temperature thresholds that trigger alerts and alarms, it's my understanding, and I believe this comes from the investigative hearing, there was discussion of this, there is an AAR standard, but I mean, it's a standard, but really each of the railroads sets its own threshold, temperature thresholds, correct?
That's correct.
And and again, I think this was somewhat anecdotal, but at the hearing, as I recall, some of the questioning indicated that while there is an AAR standard, each of the railroads, I believe, sets a standard, a temperature standard that is actually higher than the AAR standard.
They ranged. Some of the standards were, as far as the critical alarms, I think on some non-core routes on one of the Class 1s, it was 136 degrees, and I think one of the Class 1s was as high as 190 prior to East Palestine. So I think post-East Palestine, it's come down to, last I checked, it was still 136 to 180 range. But I know the AAR got a commitment from all the Class 1s to drop it down to 170.
Well, that would be encouraging because there is a lot of variability here, and it does seem like a little more of a standard approach within the industry might be helpful.
Yes, sir.
And with regard to spacing of detectors, I think the only guidance comes from an AAR circular, and that circular only applies to key routes. Is that correct?
Prior to East Palestine, the only guidance or recommendation was through the OT 55 or whatever that was referenced, that Paul referenced earlier, and it was a maximum spacing of 40 miles on key routes for key trains.
And is that changing now in the wake of...
Since then, with the safety memo that the Association of American Railroads put out on March 8th, they've committed to trying to do a 15-mile average.
And I guess sort of a kind of a broader question here. I assume these limitations, these challenges in terms of detecting bearings are not unique to the United States. Are there any trends or technologies or approaches we're seeing outside the U.S. that might be instructive in terms of importing some of those ideas here?
I think you're seeing some of the outlying technologies maybe in other countries since East Palestine with the thermal and with the multi-beam and with some of the other technologies that have arisen. But I think the struggles are the same in other countries that the U.S. deals. It's not unique to the U.S.
Thank you. Chair, I'm going to try to save some time here. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Member Brown.
Yes, building on Tom and Member Graham's comment, the Association of American Railroads announced some new safety measures on March 8th of last year, addressing hot bearing detector spacing, which Tom just talked about, temperature threshold, close call reporting, training, and tank car improvements. Do you think these will make a significant impact on safety?
While I think they'll help, certainly decreasing the distance between the detectors will help. I think it's a step in the right direction, but as you can see in East Palestine, they already met the new threshold. So certainly that will help, but it's not the answer.
Do you have any information about talking to the other than Northern Fork Southern who are focusing on this issue? I mean, Tom mentioned, do you have any more information?
No,
are they operating in silos, or are they communicating?
No,
with
they're all
CSX?
communicating now, and I don't think there were necessarily silos, like, I'm not going to talk to you kind of thing. I think they just didn't communicate as well, where I know we've actually attended some of the meetings where they get together and talk about you know, hey, I've got this technology, it's working really well, and they discuss amongst themselves to try to build a better detection system.
Thank you. No further questions.
Member Inman.
As I hear you all talking, I'm thinking about in about 2.5 months, we'll be doing an aviation hearing. And rail is, I remember being at the promissory point for the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. Aviation's been around a lot less, but yet we've been able to make huge strides in not only regulation, but safety. And so I'm just kind of wondering, if rail's been around this long, everything we continue to say here is AAR, which is a trade group. Why do they get to regulate themselves versus every other mode of transportation?
The AR exists for, one of the purposes AR exists, they do create standards, but they also control billing standards. So most railroads don't own their own cars. They're owned by car owners and they're leased to the railroads. So they created standards, so it's fair across all, right now, 6 Class 1 railroads. There's a minimum standard that cars have to meet. For example, the 170 degrees on the bearing. If it's less than 170 degrees and the railroad decides to change the bearing out, they can't charge the owner for it. They have to pay for it themselves. So if it meets that criteria, and there's a lot of different criteria, I'm just specifically talking about the wheel. If it meets that 170 degrees or higher mark, they can bill the owner. So it's standard and fair across all 6 Class 1s.
Paul?
Yeah, just to add to that, the AAR creates standards and recommended practices, and there is an executive order that requires government agencies to incorporate by reference such standards and practices. So it is codified in the federal regulation by reference.
Is there any other industry you know of that has that luxury to set their own standards for billing?
I'm not sure I can answer that for other modes, but there are other, you know, in highway, for instance, tank truck.
Let me go into bearing detector spacing. And I know we talked about averages and we polled a lot of the Class 1s. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And so whenever we were looking at East Palestine, they were meeting the intent by having one every 15 miles, but it was within a 30-mile segment, so that one was 20 miles and another was 10. Did we also ask then for what your minimum and maximums were from these Class 1s when we polled them?
We didn't ask at the time. We have since asked. I have not received any of that information. My understanding was they were polling all that information through the AAR, and they were supposed to get us that data.
Wait a second. Can you say that they were holding the data?
They were polling all their. I specifically reached out to all Class 1s. I did not get a response. I'll say the responses I did get were that they were. The AAR was taking the same poll, and they would provide the information to me.
And so have we received that from AAR?
No, sir, I have not.
Is there any reason why they wouldn't provide the safety investigators for their motor transportation this information?
I'm not aware of any.
I think I'm done for right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Great line of questioning. I think we'll find when we get to a pipeline investigation that they also set their own standards, which is a significant concern. I'm hoping to do a little math here, and while I do it, Brett, maybe you can bring up that slide that showed the 10 miles and then the 20 miles between the detectors. The train passed a detector, then 10 miles later passed another one, then 20 miles later passed another one. Can anyone do, what's 10 plus 20? 30?
30.
Yeah, what's the average of 30?
15.
Is the AAR standard that was adopted on March 8th to have a maximum of 15 miles per hour on average for spacing detectors?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, would that have done anything for this one to prevent it?
No, ma'am.
Not a single thing. So you're basically adopting the exact same thing, 10 miles, 20 miles, 30, 15 miles per average. They're adopting the exact same thing that occurred here.
Yes,
Is that based on science?
I'm not sure where they got their basis.
Probably not based on science. It would do absolutely nothing. Now, I will say Norfolk Southern has stated that they have a maximum, not of average, of 15 miles per hour for spacing detectors after this one. But I want someone to talk, if someone could speak to, and maybe it's you, Mr. Scott, about using averages. I have a real concern about using averages because it's not just AAR. FRA's looking at averages. Congress is talking about averages. When you talk about averages, you could have one that's 5 miles spaced and then not another one for 25 miles. You're still looking at an average of 15 miles. So can you talk about the concern with using averages versus maximums?
Yes, so I've seen a couple studies on spacing. There has been some, I won't say private testing, but testing in Pueblo at the former technology institute there. They did some spacing data, and they essentially found that 15 miles was the ideal spacing, but not average 15 miles. They did say that they didn't see a significant difference between 7 and 15 miles, but they did see a pretty good increase between 15 miles and 20 miles. So it was like a 25% increase. I'm not sure the exact number, but it was around 25% increase from 15 to 20 miles.
Thank you very much. We've looked at hot bearing detectors. We've talked about acoustic bearing detectors. There are not that many in the United States or throughout North America. Professor Tarawan mentioned that acoustic bearing detectors are more effective for determining failures. But there's lots of technology, including onboard technology with sensors. Is it one or the other, or are we looking at a more comprehensive approach to using many different types of technology for predicting bearing failures?
That's why we're requesting the research, because there hasn't been much research in this area to see which would be better on the restraints, the pros and cons of each, and do they need to be used in tandem, or is there a fix-all that you only have to use one? So I believe that's where we need the research in this area. Thank
you. We do have extra time, so I want to see Member Graham. Do you have anything? Member Chapman? Member Brown? Member Inman? No? Okay. I had scheduled a break, but we have time, I think, to go to another round. Do you want to go right into round 2, and then we'll take a lunch break? Okay, great. We are going to move into round 2, or safety issue 2, and that is the initial emergency response. And we're going to start with questions from Member Graham, who's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. The first 911 call came in at 8:56. They dispatched the East Palestine Fire Department at 8:58. What time did the fire department arrive on scene?
A little bit after 9 p.m.
Seems like a pretty fast response for a small
quick
community.
response.
That's
Yes.
great. Shortly after arriving on scene, the East Palestine Fire Department began fighting the post-derailment fire. What fire suppression techniques were used to fight the fire, and was it effective?
Yes, so they utilized many suppression activities, including heavy master streams from unmanned monitor nozzles, including elevated streams from ladder trucks. Amount of fire like that, there's not enough water available. So the deputy fire chief, who was the incident commander, in his interview stated that even when they were applying the fire on it, the fire just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, so it was not effective.
Not effective. Thank you. I see 48 agencies were reportedly involved in the emergency response, including fire departments from East Liverpool and Beaver County. What was the degree of hazardous materials experience or training from the responding agencies?
Yeah, so those experience varied. The responding hazardous materials team from East Liverpool and Beaver County, they were the responding hazardous materials teams. So they had technicians trained to the technician level, including the cache of equipment that they would need for detections, sampling, all that stuff. So they brought people trained to do technician level work. They never got into that phase. Other responding agencies, those training levels varied from responders not having any hazardous materials training to responders that were trained to the awareness, operations, and technician level.
Great. During that response, were any of the firefighting roles tailored to each firefighter's training or experience within the response?
Yeah, that's hard to do when you allow various levels of training, allowing responders to have no training at all to having firefighters trained to the highest training, which is firefighter 2. An incident commander bases his emergency response actions on training expertise. So if I don't know the minimum training levels of at least an emergency responder that's coming as a firefighter 1, that's prohibited from performing actions in an IDLH atmosphere or doing any type of advanced fire attack stuff, it's hard to set those emergency action plans. So that's why it's important to have at least that firefighter 1 minimum across the board. I know what I'm getting. I know what I'm getting. I know I can put these people to work in certain situations.
Great, thank you for that. The command post was first established 400 feet from the fire. What increased risks to the firefighters were associated with the establishment of that command post 400 feet away from the fire?
Yeah, NFPA and both the National Incident Management System states that a command post should be established in a cold zone. You want your staff away from the hazards, from smoke accumulation, from fires and all that stuff. So you want your decision makers, and then including your firefighters too, out of the danger zone until those proper actions could be put in place. The initial command post was at the Lake Oil property, which was roughly 400 or 500 feet from the burning rail cars, definitely inside the hot zone, which NFPA states that the command post should not be in a hot zone.
So I know they didn't get the consist for, about an hour, I think it was at least.
Yeah.
But seeing the tank cars when they arrived and trying to put out the fire, what was the ERG guidance for tank car fires?
That would be for Guide 111, as I showed in my presentation earlier. The emergency response guide provides a decision tree matrix, a yes and no decision tree, depending on what you can see. That's depending on placards. If I can see the placards, if I can see identification markings on rail cars or anything like that. If I can't, and that night there was low visibility, a lot of smoke, so it would be almost impossible to see those indicators to let you know what you're dealing with. The emergency response guide takes the safest course of action and leads you to Guide 111, which is that 1/2 mile evacuation zone. Keep your people away from the area.
Great, thank you. I see my time's up.
Thank you. Member Chapman.
Just following up on that quickly, so the Guide 111 is essentially a default. If you don't have sufficient information, that's where you go.
Absolutely.
Question about the train consist. I believe the first request for that information was made at 9:04 p.m.
Yes.
And that request was made by calling the Norfolk Southern Dispatch Center. The information wasn't provided at that time. Do we know why? No,
we could not determine. The East Palestine Fire Dispatch Center called the NS Atlanta Dispatch Center around 9:04. The person that answered the call at the NS Dispatch Center told the dispatch center in East Palestine that they would call them back. We could not determine if that phone call was ever returned.
And what has Norfolk Southern done since the accident to try to ensure that there's better response in a circumstance like that?
Yeah. So right now, NS has partnered with a solution called Rapid SOS. It's a robust it's a robust technology that would provide real-time train contests to emergency responders. It actually goes to the dispatch centers, and the dispatch centers can forward this out to emergency responders' phones. Almost like an Ask Rail on steroids, but I don't have to input any data. So NS is also partnered up with the Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency and trained a lot of the emergency responders on the Ask Rail application, and have also completed training in 5 of their 911 dispatch centers. So it's been a proactive action so far.
And in your view, are those pretty substantial improvements in terms of?
Yes, I do, absolutely.
And I do want to talk about the Ask Rail application. Based on interviews, the East Liverpool Fire Department fire chief said that one of his technicians was able to obtain a copy of the train consist before arriving, and that was, I believe, at 9:54 p.m. And then he received an emailed copy from the CCEMA director at 10:23. And that's an important 29 minutes under the circumstances, obviously. But the Beaver County Director of Emergency Services and the Chief of Hazard Materials reported that he was unable to get the same Ask Rail application to work until about 2:00 a.m., several hours later.
Yes.
Can you comment on the discrepancy of those two experiences? Do we know why that occurred?
Yeah, so we know that interviewing the East Liverpool fire chief, he had his technician that was riding with him in his emergency response vehicle. They found one of the rail cars in a safe location out of the hot zone area, and you can easily input a rail car number in the Ask Rail. And it provided him everything that he needed, the train consist, all that. He was able to get to it. When talking to the director of Beaver County, for some reason, when he tried to use the Ask Rail application, it would not load for him. It would not load for him. That's going to be, that's any problem. With an Ask Rail mobile application, you always have to have some type of cell phone activity, cell phone coverage connected to a Wi-Fi, things of that nature. That's why a lot of your fire apparatus now are equipping your units with Wi-Fi capabilities, that they would always have that boost in cell phone service so they can get to applications like Ask Rail and things of that nature.
Do we think this might have been a connectivity issue?
Yeah, he could not. We asked him, did he know what the problem was? He didn't know if could have been a problem with the app. It could have been a cell phone service. I really don't know if it's so many users will get on it that it runs out of bandwidth.
Yeah.
I don't know that, but we just know that the East Palestine fire chief brought it up easily. The Beaver County director did have problems getting to Ask Rail.
And Ask Rail is an AAR app, is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
And has there been any post-accident effort by AAR to boost the performance of Ask Rail or address any of the issues that we saw here?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Member Brown.
Yeah, I just want to build on the Ask Rail. My question, because Member Chapman got just about all of it, but do you think it's going to be very consistent in rural areas, given like my home state of Florida, they have a lot of hurricanes and storms? Will they still work if the app will still work if there are no cell towers?
It's just like any type of application that you have to deal with cell phone activity. The nation's cell service, it depends on if it's weather, if it's anything, rural areas. But the thing about Ask Rail, it's still a good application. It's an application that can be used from a safe distance. It allows that emergency responder to keep themselves out of harm's way while getting that app, or maybe waiting for that train consist from a train crew. But there's going to be situations where the app may not work, and it was proven at East Palestine.
Thank you.
Member Inman.
Thank you. And Paul, I'd like to take you back a little bit. In our research, we found where the NTSB had investigated 3 derailments involving vinyl chloride. The first one in Livingston, Louisiana, September 28, 1982, 42 years ago. I'm pretty sure you didn't work that one.
I was around, but not there.
Paulsboro, New Jersey, November 30th, 2012. And then, of course, East Palestine. I think it's worthy to call out the incident commander, the chief and the deputy chief. Can you mention the differences in what we investigated in the Paulsboro versus this? Because I think you led that as an IIC, correct?
I did. At the Paulsboro derailment, there was a circumstance there where the train derailed on a movable bridge, and one of the vinyl chloride tank cars, which incidentally was a sister tank car to the one involved here in East Palestine, was punctured. It was constrained in the bridge structure, and a trailing car coupler punctured the tank wall and released a vapor cloud that lingered over the creek. The name of the creek was Montauk Creek. And the vapor cloud hung in that area for quite a while and then drifted into the town of Paulsboro. Well, the deputy fire chief lived next to the bridge, and he established his command post about 50 yards from the breach tank car, exposing his crew and all of the responders to the vapor.
Much different situation that we're seeing now.
Yes, sir.
In 42 years ago, in rereading that Livingston, Louisiana report, they had trouble getting the consist information and identifying what was involved. Did they have the same thing in Paulsboro, New Jersey?
I do recall there was difficulty. It seems like it happens on every derailment that we have this issue come up. I remember that there was discussion about getting the consist from Conrail in the hands of the first responders, yes.
Perennial problems.
It's
that every time that we
single,
investigate, we are told that they're going to make changes and things are going to get better?
Very unusual that doesn't come up.
Thank you. Troy, I know we kind of talked about, being a former instructor for the National Fire Academy, I used to teach these volunteer fire departments, and it was identified, very early on about the amount of training. And you talked about the 36-hour rule and how it didn't include hazmat training. I would suspect that was well-intentioned whenever it was originally written and may now need to be reevaluated. But what's probably the biggest barrier for volunteer fire departments to actually get the additional training that they need?
And it's just not only in East Palestine, it's every volunteer fire department that's in the nation. It's the 40-hour work week. I'm a volunteer, plus I have a job, so, but plus I want to support my community to help them out in any way. It's finding funding for training. Some of these classes are $1,500 or $2,000. To outfit a firefighter alone with structural firefighting gear and SCBA, you're talking $20,000, $25,000 with equipment. So it's a funding issue. It's a time issue to get the volunteers into training. It's travel times. Some states have supported good support with volunteers where they do incentive programs. For one, the state of Maryland actually gives volunteer firefighters tax breaks, which it lures people to come to the fire department and go, hey, what can I do to help to get that tax break? So there's things to do, and they're researchable, but it will always be a problem with the volunteer.
And I guess I want to point out, I think we're going to have a recommendation to the state of Ohio, but I know that Governor DeWine put together this task force, and while it's not fully incorporated, it is discussing those barriers and has some really great recommendations. And I hope that the state will take that up, along with a lot of other states in the National Volunteer Fire Council.
Yeah, that's a very good report.
And I'd be hesitant not to put up. I've got my binders. This week is National Fire Data Week, and the U.S. Fire Academy has actually put out a report in October of last year regarding funding barriers and how rural departments can find those. So I hope we can help make those resources available as well, just as an educational tool.
Yep.
Thank you. I want to back up a little bit because we have a lot of members of the community here and just talk about what we sort of take for granted when we're talking about these issues. We have the opportunity to review it all. What does a train consist convey? And what important safety decisions are made by emergency responders based on timely receipt of that consist information?
Good, Paul.
So a train consist is a list of all of the rail cars on a train, and on that list are highlighted the hazardous materials that are on the train in order of the consist, or in order of the composition of the train from front to back. The hazardous materials are identified by the DOT proper shipping name, the hazard class, the UN ID number, which is used to look up information about the hazards of the chemical, and the packing group is appropriate. It also, if you know where the derailment begins and where a derailment ends, then you can take that section of the consist and figure out what potential hazardous materials are involved in the incident. And that's important to know so that you can then determine the appropriate evacuation distance, the appropriate personal protective equipment that's required, and the community evacuations that are necessary.
And we have repeatedly investigated accidents, derailments where train consist information was not provided in a timely manner, including accurate train consist information in Anding, Mississippi. But for this one, we had responders, everybody, and I'll just focus on the incident commanders. The deputy chief was asking for what was on that train for quite some time. I think it's really fortunate that one of the volunteer firefighters from that department was also a chemistry teacher and was utilized on scene to evaluate some of the dangers. I thought that was really resourceful and incredible, but not ideal. When you have a derailment that occurs at 8:56, you have an ATC desk back in Atlanta that can hit a button. It's not walking around with papers anymore as it was decades ago. You have a button that you can hit send and get that information immediately to those who need it. Norfolk Southern, in this case, showed up on scene without that information. In fact, they were asked for that information repeatedly after they showed up. Now, I do understand the county had it. I have questions on sharing of that information an hour later, but it was still an hour later. So that, I will show, if we can pull up that video of, this was shared with me by Chief Comstock. Thank you, Chief, who heads the Western Joint Fire District. I think that's good. At the time, the chief was out of town. He got this video from his responders. He pulled them back, told them to get back. But this is why. This is why, I'm a mom. We have, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds that are volunteer firefighters. They need to be protected, which is why we're talking about training opportunities and the need for train consist information. I'll get to training in the second round. But a question I have regarding train consist information, then you have placards that burn. Certainly there is stenciling and other sort of technology that the railroads could voluntarily move to ensure placards aren't getting burned, to ensure paint isn't burning off. And then there's the Ask Rail app where people cannot log on. I think there are some limitations because when you have a train derailment, car line 23 can now be somewhere else. So there are some limitations, not just cell service, but also the location of those cars. With that, I am going to ask Member Graham to go ahead for another 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to go back to the emergency response guide. And what does that state about the appropriate evacuation zone for derailed tank cars with unknown contents?
1/2 mile radius evacuation.
Okay, that's for the public. Is that for the firefighters?
That's for the emergency responders as well. It's always life safety first for everyone.
Okay, so initially, at minimum, should have been a 1/2 mile
Absolutely.
when they showed up.
Yes.
Even the firefighters.
Yes.
Can you discuss the risk of the water from the firefighting activities entering containers with unknown contents?
Yeah, it's a major concern because actually in Guide 111, it states that some of the products may be water reactive. So I might be spraying water on a hazardous chemical that could actually make a situation worse, either some type of explosive or chemical reaction, spreading the fire. So sometimes putting water on fires that you really don't know what you're putting it on could make matters worse, but you just don't know what the chemicals are.
So very important to
Yes.
know the consist and what you're up against. And not knowing the contents of the tank cars initially when they showed up, how do incident commanders determine the appropriate PPE for the responding firefighters?
Yeah, because that's also stated in Guide 111 as well. And again, unknown chemicals. Regular structural firefighting gear is not suitable for all occasions. So some chemicals could actually break down a firefighter's protective equipment. It could break down your SCBA, your SCBA that you're wearing. It could affect the rubber seal around your face. So it's sometimes the guide states, don't rush in, take your time, research what you have, use the Guide 111, keep your people safe, and wait for the experts to come in that know more about the trains, know more about the burning chemicals, and then set that safest course of action once everything's been researched.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to jump over to the consist for just a second. Does Norfolk Southern have a procedure or policy for distribution of that to first responders?
Yeah, they do. It's under HM1.
HM1?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to switch to the placarding right now. We know it's important to have legible placards and everything, and we knew the environment that they were up against, the dark and things burning. It was very difficult to see the placards and everything. Can you discuss the East Palestine Deputy Fire Chief's observations of the tank car placards while on scene in the aftermath of the derailment?
Yeah, he described the placards not being able to be identified, either being burned off. This happened at night, so you got low light visibility and you got a lot of smoke accumulation. So that's going to affect all types of visibility on trying to read the placards. And then high heat flame impingement actually destroyed the placards where they couldn't properly be identified.
How can placards be designed to improve the survivability when exposed to a fire like at the derailment?
It's a good question, Member Graham. We've been shown some examples of solutions to that with the use of intumescent paint. There's another solution where in the placard holder you have the tag board placard placed in front of a stenciled cutout on steel, so that if the placard were to burn away, you would at least have a UNID number and a hazard symbol that even though it might not be the correct color, you would still be able to identify the material. So there are a number of solutions to that. The biggest problem here, as Chair Hamady pointed out, when you have a chaotic derailment and the tank cars get moved around, even if you have the consist, it's very hard to determine which cars are where, what's involved and what's not involved. The tank car reporting marks, the tank car number is indexed to the train consist. So you need to be able to find that or the placard. Without either one, you're totally lost, and that's what happened here.
Yeah, I remember even, I think it was Sunday morning, we were at the Incident Command Center looking at our drone footage, trying to figure out, everybody was there trying to figure out which car was which, still, almost 2 days into it.
Yeah,
Thank you, Chair.
and again, that's what's important. Like Chair Hominy said, car 32 becomes car 16 or whatever. That's why it's important to don't rush in. Trust your emergency response guidance for the mixed cargo, and go by the safest procedures until you get the experts there and you get that training consist there. Then you can figure out what you have with what's going on.
Very good point. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Member Chapman.
Chair, only one additional question in this area, and it has to do with improving training. I really just want to ask this question to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about why we're recommending what we're recommending. There is a draft recommendation we'll consider later on today to 3 organizations: the National Volunteer Fire Council, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the International Association of Firefighters. Would you just talk about how the individual roles and then their role in combination with each other can help us improve training so we can help prevent future exposure of firefighters to unnecessary risk?
Yeah, so the National Volunteer Fire Council is the representative agency or association that represents the volunteer fire departments throughout the nation. They have a lot of symposiums, a lot of training opportunities, very robust outreach to volunteer fire departments, live training, web training. They're constantly in contact with the volunteer fire departments, trying to make them better, trying to provide them funding opportunities who you could talk to get new equipment, training opportunities, things of that nature. The International Association of Fire Chiefs, much larger, but it's dealing with more of your current or past fire chiefs, the one that could be providing that training. The fire chiefs are at that level. They got that expertise, so they can provide that training and all that stuff. So how we're proposing a recommendation is we're hitting all 3 associations that's representing every single firefighter in the United States. And actually, the International Association of Firefighters crosses the border into Canada as well. So it's the right way to go.
So pooling capabilities, pooling different focuses,
Yes.
trying to get to essentially a sort of a magnified impact in terms of improving training.
And they're all connected. They talk amongst each other all the time about training opportunities and symposiums, things of that nature.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair. That's my last question in this area.
Thank you very much. Member Brown.
Yeah, I just want to comment. To build on that, as someone who understands very well as a former mayor and how important it is for training for first responders, particularly in small towns like East Palestine, where they don't have the resources, the access. We rely on them when there's a crisis, and they deserve better training and access for opportunity and funding, not just to protect home and business, but for themselves. So I've been there and done that, and so I'm so happy to see that the recommendation I talked about, you guys are adopted, focusing on funding, particularly grants. And I think it's important that we have this opportunity to have another conversation to encourage expanding MOUs or memorandum of understanding to work with other cities or counties to support those volunteer firefighters, to access more funding, which I think is very important. So I'm looking forward to following up on that conversation with the staff, with the team, because I think it's so important. And I think it's doable, those partnerships, the shared vision of public service to keep our communities safe. And we should do everything we can to make sure safety is number one, but it's all about the resources. So I thank you for your consideration.
Yeah, the MOUs are very good. It gets the neighboring departments talking. even if it's, an MOU is, can you respond into my jurisdiction and give me some help? That's what's good. It gets to people talking. You start identifying one another. The more you train together, the better you get. And that's what's a good thing about an MOU with neighboring jurisdictions is you get to know one another, you get to train together, you get to know what resources that you can utilize. So it's going to be a very good recommendation.
Yeah, and the reason why I brought it up, because I considered an amendment on a recommendation for MOUs as a tool for smaller communities to consider as a method of establishing a formal partnership with larger communities or even cross state lines to access training opportunities at a reduced cost. And I decided not to pursue it because I want to follow up on that conversation, but I think there's a possibility that could happen.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much. Member Brown, Member Inman.
Thank you. So, Troy, inside the report, we mentioned that Beaver County Hazardous Materials Response Team supported the efforts, and they actually were providing, I think, air monitoring with photoionization detectors that could detect vinyl chloride. Did we find any evidence that they did or did not detect vinyl chloride?
Yeah, they interviewed, stated that you've got some robust meters right now, 5 and 6 gas meters that you can put, special electrochemical meters in them to detect just certain chemicals, hydrogen cyanide, vinyl chloride. These hazardous materials team come equipped with this strategic equipment. So in his interview, they did state that they detected traces of vinyl chloride, which was most likely through probably the venting process. So it's going to be an air monitoring.
While the PRDs were venting, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Not the vent and burn process.
Right. No, this is no
Paul,
Beaver.
you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, no Beaver County. All the fire department response agencies doing the testing they've already left the scene when the vent and burn took place. So Beaver County was already back at their station when the vent and burn took place.
Just a point of clarification, a photoionization detector isn't a material-specific detector. It'll detect any volatile organic compound within a very specific range. If you know the specific material that's released, then there's a correction factor, and then you can measure the actual concentration that way. But
You're actually repeating some of your work from the Paulsboro report, where, and I just wanted to point out, in that one, oxyvinyl was on scene within, I believe, 2 hours of the derailment with 2 separate detectors, provided one to the incident command and kept one as well, and provided a lot of the information regarding the amount that was being dispersed in the community at that time.
yes.
That's just shaking your head.
Yes,
correct?
that's correct. Yes.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, they measured over 500 parts per million in my recollection.
I'm sorry for going back to Paulsboro, but it's got to be frustrating in some respects, because at that point we were recommending May 15, 2012, and the FRA had said that they had met with the AAR and that they were looking to find a system to get consist information available immediately. And yet yesterday they decided to put out a rule to say that they're finally going to do it. 12 years later in multiple different crises. What would be the one thing, if we were to tell someone today what they have to do to make train and rail safety better, if they could just snap their fingers?
If you're talking about conveying hazard information to the emergency responders, do that the very first thing you do. Don't, if you have a fire in your house, you call the fire department first, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a derailment, you should call the emergency responders first before you notify your internal communication tree. Get that information in their hands right away.
Troy?
I think in general, if you want to make rail much safer, keep them from derailing.
Say it again?
Keep a train from derailing. So if a train accident doesn't happen,
KISS method, right?
I don't have to be there. Train's going to get to its designation. People may not be put in harm's way. So to me, the safest action is keep them on the rails. They're designed to stay on the rails.
I don't know that we'll put a recommendation in the actual docket for that, but it's good advice. I'll just, and one last reflection, if you will. I go back to a former chairman who wrote a concurring opinion in that report that said that there were some real concerns. Two issues became very apparent. What's the best way for emergency response community to prepare for potentially catastrophic events that are infrequent nationwide and that at any given location may not occur more than once, if that often, in the entire career of the emergency responders? Separately, given the large percentage of volunteer firefighters in our nation's forces, how can they attain the training they need to do their job adequately without being required to have so much training that people who have full-time jobs will choose not to be a volunteer firefighter? I mean, I don't know that we actually learn our lessons after each one of these derailments, but I can promise you we're going to try this time.
And this accident would have been overwhelming for any response agency.
Absolutely.
Huge, huge, huge response. And it would have been overwhelming for any response agency.
Totally agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to go back. Member Graham had asked about Norfolk Southern's protocol for relaying consist information to emergency responders, and the HM1 hazardous materials instructions for rail was mentioned as their protocol. And I'm just going to read the protocol, which says, when receiving a request for shipping documents provided to the emergency response information to emergency responders, you shouldn't have to wait to receive a request. The derailment occurred at 8:54, 8:56. The ATC desk, Atlanta knew, the crew called it in, hit the button. You don't have to wait for a request from a community to provide consist information. After Paulsboro, they came up with Ask Rail. It's not as effective. I am pleased that PHMSA finally issued a rule yesterday requiring immediate notification. Could you provide a little bit of information on that regulation that they issued yesterday, just for a second?
Yes, you want to talk about that?
Kara?
Yes, so the requirement, the rule applies to all railroads, not just Class 1s, so it applies to 2s and 3s as well. It requires immediate notification to the public safety answering point, which is essentially the 911 call center in the locality.
Immediate notification. A deputy chief should not be left without information for hours. A chief who is the incident commander should not have to wait to see it until 2 o'clock in the morning while it's laying on a table. Did we look at differences on volunteer firefighter standards between Ohio and Pennsylvania?
No, we did not. But I do know that the state of Pennsylvania has a lot more of the pro board certification trainings. Ohio has the firefighter 1 and the firefighter 2 levels that you can pro board. Pennsylvania has numerous, including instructor level, fire level 1, fire level 2, that they can pro board, which takes numerous classes to get that certification. So Pennsylvania is one of the top states that has a robust training program.
Yeah, and provides the funding as well. For volunteer firefighters, it is NFPA 1001, which is going to be incorporated in 1010. Basic first aid and CPR, and hazmat operations level training, which I'm certified at. That's beyond awareness training. And then some engine certifications with the Bureau of Fire Training Standards. So they do have more robust training. I will add to what Member Inman said. I do think the Ohio Task Force on Volunteer Fire Service did issue a good task force report, and we spoke 3 times with the Ohio State Fire Marshal about my office about this report. It was issued, unfortunately, 2 weeks before the derailment, and sort of was everybody forgot about it. It includes a lot of great information, including a statement that says volunteer firefighters are limited to 36 hours, while a paid career firefighter must complete 244 hours. The current 36-hour restriction on volunteer firefighting certification training is an outdated 40-year-old state law that has not kept pace with the constantly changing demands on the fire service. As a direct consequence of the outdated 36-hour requirement, the current volunteer firefighter curriculum delivery model is extremely fast-paced, instructor-led, classroom lecture followed by an expedited demonstration of the hands-on skills. They go through several recommendations. It's a great report. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. Hopefully, and I intend when I speak with the governor to talk about reconvening the task force. I know they'd like to do additional work to make sure that this gets the appropriate attention it deserves to ensure firefighter safety. Thank you. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. I just have one question about post-derailment actions. Can you discuss the actions Norfolk Southern has taken to improve training for first responders in East Palestine and the surrounding communities?
Yeah, they, as stated earlier, they partnered up with the CCEMA. They did some robust training on AskRail. They've been in this area for a while now doing some extra, what we call the Railroad 101 kind of training. They're promoting the AskRail training. They've provided the uploads to the fire departments. And the big one is the partnership with the Rapid SOS. That's going to be the game changer to get that concept in real time. So these fire department dispatchers are going to have to be trained in that technology as well. So they are on site. They are continuing their training and working with the fire departments to make things better.
Thank you. That's all I have, Chair.
Thank you. Member Chapman.
No further questions, Chair.
Member Brown.
No further questions.
Member Inman.
Just a quick question about incident command. And I'm going to go back again to the Lafayette, Louisiana incident. At that incident, they actually called 10 of the shippers, the chemical companies, to be on the scene to give them expert advice. Many of them at that point mentioned that they were worried about their liability of providing that advice. And we had a recommendation regarding Good Samaritan laws. You'd think that you wouldn't have to make that type of recommendation whenever a town is burning down. And we're seeing a progression maybe that shippers, as I understand, don't often show up as much in additional incidents. And I know we said there were 2 at the Paulsboro, and while oxyvinyl's experts were in the ground, they were never in the room. What's the barrier that's stopping from using that expert information and that guidance so that they're in the room and can actually raise their hand when it's necessary?
Well, by regulation, they're required to have a point of contact telephonically. Oftentimes, it's very rare that I've seen a shipper on the ground. It happens from time to time. But they're required to have a person available who has technical knowledge for mitigating an incident and knowledge of the hazardous material. It happens often that they're consulted, often from a distance, like this initially started out that way. But as I said, it's rare that they actually come to a scene. But I don't see any barrier to them to be a part of an incident command system. That system is designed to be flexible. NIMS is flexible. They could have been part of an incident command. There's just no requirement currently to require them to deploy to a scene, though.
But there is for the ship or for the railroad operator.
Well, the railroad operator definitely, because they're legally responsible for the incident. They're the responsible party.
So they're responsible for chemicals that someone else has made and has expertise on?
As the carrier, they're responsible for derailment.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I can add, Brett, can you bring up slide 102, please? So this is a slide of unified command. Unified command is for complex incidents. It's built as if your incident gets bigger, this incident command expands. It grows. What's unique about incident unified command is it's just not one sole incident commander. It's a number of incident commanders that sit at the table that make the informed decisions as a consensus, and they agree to those. Decisions to make it flow. Having one incident commander is not unified command. So, for instance, it's if you own a piece of the pie, you're going to have a seat at that table. The railroad, the shipper, it could be the car manufacturer, but then each one is broke out in its own design. So the fire department may have life safety along with law enforcement doing evacuations. You may have your railroad doing air monitoring and things of that nature. You may have your shipper doing research and stuff. But your key incident commanders are sitting at one table. And when everybody hears a decision, everybody agrees to that decision. That's what's unique about unified command.
And let me go back to one thing you just said, though. It's the hauler, the railroad, is the one that's ultimately responsible. It's not whoever's putting those contents, because we saw here that we have, and I think we'll get into a little further, we had shippers that were putting chemicals in a tank car with non-compatible material, and they've obviously utilizing some of the regulations on tank car design of not even putting steel on top, aluminums, because it's lighter, but yet they say that they're conforming to the actual rules. Is that an area we need to address further?
In different circumstances where you might have a non-accident release, the shippers are more held responsible for that than the carrier would be. The carrier will oftentimes mitigate it for the shipper, but in terms of enforcement, I think FRA would be looking at the shipper in a circumstance like that.
It all goes back to who gets billed, right?
I guess. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask about communications? There were some communications challenges, some discussion about multi-agency communication systems or response communication systems or MARCs. This is not something new. The NTSB has issued several recommendations regarding interoperability of radio communications on scenes so that responding agencies can talk to each other and communicate. Here we had 48 entities responding. They do need to talk to each other. It's a very chaotic scene. Mr. Hiller was the lead on DuPont, Washington, where there were significant communications challenges. So, Mr. Lloyd, can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, so radio interoperability has been a problem in the fire service for decades. It was actually really discussed during the 9/11 Commission reports. You had multiple agencies responding to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and they all just couldn't talk. Communications is safety vital. You have to be able to talk to one another. That's how emergency response, emergency action plans are put in place. It stops freelancing. You need that positive communication. And it's a problem, but as Member Brown spoke on earlier, that could be the importance of MOUs, reaching out to that fire department going, hey, what are your radio capabilities? This is what we have, this is what we use. What can we do combined our communication so we can talk to one another? But you're talking, it's a major funding issue for radio interoperability, millions and millions and millions of dollars. Right now, there's radio manufacturers for one portable radio to outfit a firefighter's $9,000 to $12,000. And that's depending on what bells and whistles you want with that portable radio. Whether you want multiple channels, you want radio interoperable channels, you want life-saving alerts, depends on what you want. But it's a funding issue.
Who could address funding issues?
For the fire department, a good one would be what Member Inman spoke on, would be the United States Fire Administration. Reach out to them. FEMA would be another good one. They provide millions of dollars through Safe Rack grants where fire departments that I know of have have received grant money to upgrade the radios. There's funding opportunities out there. You got to know how to research them and get those grants.
Has the county changed anything with respect to communications issues since this one?
They have not.
They have not. And in this case, they also have an emergency operations plan. They have a hazard mitigations plan. They have a hazardous materials response plan. I saw a little bit in there, but there wasn't much on train derailment. Is that right?
That's correct.
Have they changed that?
No.
Even to address communication? No. There are several opportunities. Certainly the state is watching and could provide funding. The federal government certainly could provide funding. Congress could provide funding. We don't recommend issue recommendations on funding. We've never done that. But it's certainly an opportunity and something to highlight as a resource. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and break for lunch for half an hour. We're going to go to 1:15. We'll be back here and start promptly at 1:15. Thank you very much.